Hey guys, this is Naudi Aguilar and welcome to the Functional Patterns Training for Humans workout system. This system was specifically devised to get you into the best shape of your life and to help you sustain it over the course of your entire lifetime. After watching the P90Xs, the Insanities, and the CrossFits of the world pushing what they do with their marketing, it's become apparent to me that I need to do something about it to counteract all the deficiency that they're pushing on our human body. What I found is that there's a biomechanical blueprint that is inhibiting human beings from achieving homeostasis. If we can achieve homeostasis with our bodies, that's really where our physiology becomes optimized. That's where our muscular system becomes optimized, our immune system. Pretty much all the foundations of that become optimized within the body, and we will be able to progress completely from that base point. So if we don't work around homeostasis, we are not going to progress. What I found is that the most influential factor in terms of finding homeostasis is going to be directly oriented to your movement based upon how your nervous system reacts to environmental stimulus around you. So really, what I tend to take into account in terms of what's directly influencing you is, for the most part, going to be your posture that's influenced by our cultural environment, the fact that we sit down. What I do in this training system is I directly address what exactly is happening to you in your environment already, and then from there is when I make the biomechanical adjustments in terms of periodizing your workouts to ensure that you can undo all the damage that you've done to yourself in our dysfunctional culture. There's going to be lots of great information put together in this, and it's going to help you get a clarity about how you operate with your body better than any other training system in existence today. Before we start this entire video, it's going to be crucial that we get the foundational elements of movement down before we start moving into the more advanced exercises later on in this entire system. Something that's all too common with most people is that once they start going into more complexity, their body begins to round and create these physical dysfunctions while they're going into movements like rotation and their lunges. And so it's going to be crucial that we understand the basic elements of movement before we begin to go into the more advanced stuff. As complex as everything that I do later on is, we have to realize that there's a basic foundation to each one of the exercises later on. So that everything's always going to revert back to a lunge. It's going to revert back to a squat. It's going to revert back to a neutral spine. Everything always reverts back to that. And getting these physical postures down first is going to be crucial for us mastering the biomechanics later. This section, these first 2-3 weeks that we're going to do right here is going to also be something that we'll want to regress back to later on to ensure that we're nailing and pinning down those biomechanics correctly, so that way when we go back to the progressions, once again, we're getting better mechanics. So this is something that you're going to want to practice pretty much for the rest of your life, and you want, like, even after you get advanced, you're going to want to sequence this in later on, and just to make sure that you're still doing everything properly and to secure that we're going to be sustainable over the course of the long term. The first piece of equipment that you'll need is going to be a resistance band. Get one that's more to your level. This is a very, very heavy resistance type band, so this is going to be something that's going to be more for somebody who's very advanced and very strong. I also have one of these Century Medicine balls. This is a very bouncy one. This one's going to be more, so when you do things like slams, it's going to really just kind of conform to the ground. It's a little more user-friendly when you use it. This is about a 6-pounder. You can go anywhere between 4 to 12 pounds, and you should be good to go from there. We're going to have a couple of kettlebells here. That's, again, just relative to your level, relative to your strength. For me, I'm just going to be, for this video, I'm going to be using 2 10-pounders. But simply for demonstration. Typically for myself, I would probably use something a little bit heavier, to about 20 to 30 pounds for many of the exercises. I'm also going to be utilizing some dumbbells. Again, cater it to what your strength levels are. For me, 10 pounds, again, is just for demonstration. For myself personally, I'll usually tend to use like 20-pound dumbbells. And we'll also need a mat. Something you'll also need is your own body, because we will probably be doing a whole lot of body weight exercises along with all these other things. But if you get all these pieces of equipment together, I mean, you're looking at maybe at most, maybe like a $75 to $100 investment. Very, very low price, and you get a whole lot of bang for your buck with that. The only dilemma is going to be you learning how to use them, and I've already got you covered on that one. Now, when it comes to utilizing the resistance band, since I do have a Kaiser machine here, a pulley system, I'm probably not going to be using this, but you can tie this anywhere. You can tie it to a post, you can put it on a door anchor, and use it in the same way that I'll be utilizing my pulley system. Before we start this video, we're gonna have to think about the foundations of all movement before we're going into any types of progression. If you look at a human being, the most basic movement pattern that a person is going to have, or the most basic dynamic of a human's movement relative to other species, is the fact that we stand on 2 feet, and then eventually we begin to walk. But the key point is that we stand. We've all heard the saying before that before you crawl, you have to walk. I tend to disagree with that a little bit, simply because I know that we have to stand and center ourselves and then walk. So if we start from a good standing position beforehand, we're going to definitely put ourselves on a better path towards success. Now, if you are looking to get more specifics on this standing position first, I would recommend checking out my book and some of the other videos where I address this to its full degree, because it is something that is very complex, and it's not necessarily something that I'll have the time to explain in this alone, because the book itself was almost about 150 pages covering this topic itself. So the standing position can be very complex, and addressing that is a science in itself. So if you haven't gotten that mastered yet, be sure to check out my other products and my books and my videos to ensure that you actually get those dynamics down, you understand what a neutral stance is, and then from there we can move on into doing the more advanced exercises. But for right now, I'm just going to give you guys more of the basics of what we're looking at when it comes to a neutral standing posture. To begin, we're going to start by just analyzing what a dysfunctional posture is going to look like, and then eventually I'm going to show you guys what a functional posture is going to look like. Right now we're covering the anterior view of what we'll normally find to be problematic with people's posture. We'll start at the feet. Basically speaking, if we look at most people's posture, they usually tend to have a duck walk. Occasionally you'll have somebody who has their toes rotated inward, but that's not necessarily common for most people. We'll be looking at that, the toes kind of pointing outward. Accompanied by that, you'll usually find an outward rotation of the knees along with that. Sometimes you'll find people that have their knees rotated inward, but most of the time we'll find an outward rotation of the knees. Also with that problem, we're going to find an anterior shifting of the pelvis, which you guys can't really tell right now, but what that's going to promote is almost like this elongation of the lower abdomen, which then is going to leave the hips getting ahead of the shoulders, and then bringing about this forward burgeoning of the shoulders and a rounding of the thoracic spine. Accompanied with that, we'll see a protracting and an internal rotation of the humerus. Then we're also going to see an upper trapezius elevation that comes across that. Now, these main dysfunctions are going to be a result of a body adapting itself to sitting down into a chair and then trying to rebalance itself as it's standing up. We have to realize that there's going to be efficient and deficient centers of gravity. Right now we're looking at a center of gravity that's there, but it's just going to be relatively flimsy, and we want to be sure that we're kind of correcting that. So this is really what we're going to be looking at on the front view of the body when it's in dysfunction. Now we're going to go into the lateral view. Taking a look at the lateral view of what's happening with the body, the primary thing that we're going to be looking at for the most part, other than the other dysfunctions I'll mention later on, is the positioning of the lumbopelvic region as she's in the standing position. We have to look at primarily the position of this being ahead of the shoulder. Now, the reason this happens is, specifically speaking, that when the hip flexor muscles get very, very tight from us sitting down over an extended period of time, we're going to shunt the activation of the gluteus maximus on the opposite end via reciprocal inhibition. So really what that is one muscle gets tight, another muscle gets very loose and weak, and it forgets how to activate. So by these muscles getting tight, it's going to restrict these muscles on their primary function, and little by little we're going to start to notice a shift in the pelvis coming forward, as you'll see with her right here. What then that's going to do is place a lot of pressure right here on the lower lumbar region. Then we're also going to notice kind of like a pooching, almost where there's like this elongation of the lower abdomen. And then from there, to compensate what the body does, because it has a deficient center of gravity, the thoracic is then going to round forward, and we'll start seeing these curvatures begin to happen in her biomechanical structure. A few more things to watch from here. It's kind of the knee alignments, that the knees may be slightly off. You won't see very many straight lines happening in the body right here. We'll also see the knuckles pointing in this direction rather than pointing at you. So the knuckles will be turning inward, indicating that we have an internal rotation in the humerus. Also, upper trapezius stimulation along for the ride going here. So that's the lateral view of what's going on. Now let's move on to the posterior view. All right, looking at the posterior end of a dysfunctional posture in terms of a standing position, we're going to again be looking at external rotations of the feet. It's hard for her to do this now, so sometimes I have to readjust her because she's been so used to actually having her feet straight forward. So right now I'm kind of having to force her to go into that external rotation. But we'll see right here, the feet are going to be turning outward. We'll look at this. We might see a bend in the Achilles tendon that usually is accompanied by that, where we actually get a supination. Sometimes you also get flat feet that come inward, so the Achilles tendon will oftentimes have that. We're going to generally, for the most part, you won't really be able to notice too much. If you have somebody's shirt off, what you'll notice is these jagged kind of angles happening in the lumbar spine because she's kind of going into that lumbar extension. But the main thing that we're going to notice from the posterior end is kind of a rounding happening of the posture here. And you'll see that this entire thoracic vertebrae is completely stretched out and exposed to a point where it's not going to be able to function at a proper point, into a proper activation. So this is going to be a region of the spine that's going to reveal itself the most when we're looking at the posterior view. If we look at the upper trapezius muscles, we'll notice up here there's going to be a major overdevelopment where there's a shrugging simply because there's no support structures down here for the lower trapezius to pin back the posture. So again, just looking at this, the main thing we're going to find out here on the posterior end is going to be the thoracic spine. Occasionally what you might find is kind of a shifting of weight or a shifting of the hips where you may see asymmetrical dysfunctions where the lines don't meet up, but typically you may not notice that too much. It may not be so pronounced. The main thing I want you guys focusing on is this thoracic spine because that will be a crucial thing to notice later on throughout this video. All right, so we covered a structurally deficient posture and I showed you the anterior, lateral, and posterior views of what will happen. Now I'm going to start to show you guys what to look for if you're looking to do something correctly in terms of a posture. So this is going to be what a structurally efficient posture is supposed to look like. This is the base point to all your training. If you are not standing correctly, it is impossible to progress yourself from this point. So a mastery of this exercise is of utmost importance over everything that you're going to do in terms of the training system that I'm putting you through in this program. So make sure that you master this technique. Make sure you understand it and you ingest the information because this will be very vital in your success in your training program. So the first thing we're going to be looking at right off the bat, we'll start at the feet. The feet need to be pointing straight forward. Let's internally rotate this one just a little further. So this needs to be pointing straight forward. This is pretty much going to set the foundations up for the legs to work in the sagittal plane. Generally speaking, if you're going to be running straight forward or going into a sprint, which is very functional for a human body, all these joints here need to be moving in the sagittal plane. If you turn the feet outward, what you're then promoting instead is an outward kicking of the legs, which then in turn is going to put a significant amount of pressure on the knees and eventually on the lumbar region. And so we do not want these types of dynamics happening when you're moving in the sagittal plane. When these turn straight forward, we're aligning all the joints to make sure that we're going to get effective movement coming straight forward from the lower limbs. We're going to also look at the knees. Knees should be pointing straight forward. We don't want any external rotation of the knees and we don't want any internal rotation of the knees. Moving into the hips, we're going to notice the navel should be drawn in here. So the navel is going to be drawn in all the way to the spine. This is indicating that we have activation happening in the transverse abdominis, which is going to act to support the spine. If we look right here, there should be a nice open posture via the usage of a retracted scapula and an extended thoracic spine. So now we'll notice a very open posture here, subsequently bringing the hands facing each other in this direction. So now we'll see a good external rotation happening at the humerus. Followed by that, we're going to notice a nice relaxed cervical region here on the anterior end and even at that upper trapezius, which was very problematic in the views that I had given you before on a structurally deficient posture. So this is a very good view of what a good posture should look like. Another big thing to look at is how big her rib cage is here, that she's able to really expand that And just her standing right here, she should be feeling some core activation just from standing here alone, because she's really integrating her posture very well. So a good way to test to see if you do have a strong integrated posture or not is usually if you push somebody from the side, you'll see the entire body stay together as one unit. Rather than if I push her like with your body, typically what will happen, there might be like a kink in the middle that happens from here to here because there's no core function happening in the body. Let's go back to the normal standing posture. As you see, she has a very good command of this, and all the body is structurally integrating. We see all the alignments happening in the body. This is some good posture. Let's move on into the lateral view. Looking at a lateral view here of the posture, what we're going to try and notice is a nice straight line happening from the ankles to the knees to the hips to the shoulders and all the way up into the cervical columns. We should notice a nice straight geometric line moving up and down. And from what I'm seeing here, it's pretty darn good. Since the feet are straight forward, it's going to allow us to have a little better base right here in the lower limbs. The main thing we want to focus on right here is the positioning of the lumbopelvic region. As I mentioned in the dysfunctional posture, what's going to generally happen is that anterior shifting of the pelvis. What we want to focus on here is the pelvis moving backward. The pelvis is going to move backward, and then from there we're going to rotate the pelvis posteriorly. So the main things I want you guys thinking about when you're trying to implement this standing posture is that when you're standing in this position, what you'll need to do is actually shift your pelvis back and then rotate the pelvis under. The main movements you want to think about are pelvic rotation, pelvic tilt, which is anterior pelvic tilts, posterior pelvic tilts, but then we also have to include anterior pelvic shifts where the pelvis is shifting anteriorly, and then posterior pelvic shifting. What we need to implement, if she's in an anterior pelvic shift and an anterior pelvic tilt, is that she shifts the pelvis back first, and then that naturally will then allow us to posteriorly tilt the pelvis. So this is going to be a crucial thing to notice when you're trying to implement these techniques. After she's gotten these dynamics set in, now we're going to set the foundations up for the thoracic spine. So this is going to enable us to get better activation here in the T-spine, because now there's a support structure at the lower ends. From there, if she retracts her scapula, we'll notice a nice straight thoracic spine. What then follows after that is a good external rotation. You can see the knuckles right here. Everything is in line right here at the humerus. Then if we also look at the cervical spine, there is no forward head posture. So by having the spine completely in a straight line here, we're seeing all the things begin to line up. The core function is happening. You'll notice a nice expansion of the ribs. Lots of good stuff going on here. Let's move on into the posterior end. Looking at the posterior end of the body here, we're going to notice primarily over all other parts is that the T-spine here is going to be highly functional. This is going to also enable us to retract the scapula. Let's pin those back a little further, which is going to then enable us to begin to stabilize the shoulder. So this is the crucial thing that we'll see out of the posterior end. If somebody had their shirt off, you might notice that this would be nice and smooth happening at the lumbar. But as we'll see right here, everything is stacking, everything is aligned. Right now we'll also see the Achilles tendons are nice and straight. If anything, if you want to try for yourself, what you can do, if your Achilles tendon bends outward, you can lift your pinky toe up here on each side, and that'll kind of help straighten the Achilles tendons out if you're standing where you're at. Again, this is a phenomenal standing position, and this is definitely where we need to be in terms of posture dynamics, and this is just a very good alignment happening here. Another thing that we want to focus on that I didn't mention in the lateral view is that you should be primarily on your heels while you're doing this kind of an exercise in terms of standing, and we want to make sure that we're putting most of our pressure back here. To cover the execution of the standing position, let's go with our posture turned off. Let's try going deficient posture. Okay, so we're going to be looking at trying to correct things, and more than likely what we're going to see out of a lateral view here, the main thing we got to focus on, once again, the pelvis has to move back. We have to shift our weight onto our heels. The pressure has to be under the heels. Typically for most people, when they shift their pressure, it's going to be on the toes, and that's going to usually lead to the shifting of the pelvis coming forward. So let's make sure we get on those heels. So let's put the pressure on the heels. Then we're going to shift the pelvis back. We need to have the pelvis shifted back so that way we can then force the pelvis to go into a posterior tilt. Then from there, this is almost going to look somewhat flat, but this is really what we're trying to do here is promote a neutral spine. We're trying to promote a nice straightness here, so that way we have a base for the thoracic spine to work off of. So again, we're posteriorly rotating the pelvis because most people will generally have a tilt moving forward here. We need to bring that back so that way we can start incorporating gluteal activation. So if you are in this position and your glutes are in a stable set foundation, what we then want to do is incorporate a gluteal activation. I want you to contract your glutes there, Lindsay. We're going to fire off the glutes. Since they're now in position, now we can begin to institute some muscular activation along with that. Something that what may end up happening when we try doing that is that the core may begin to fall out. For her, she's actually doing a really good job. So if we lift this here, you'll also notice that with her glute activation, she also has a neutral spine happening. So the TVA, the transverse abdominis, is working in conjunction with the glutes. From there, after she's got the TVA functioning, we'll also look at the T-spine working, and this is, again, another good alignment. So we're looking at pelvic function being the main thing that we want to look at. Now, something else that you can do, for those of you that may have problems getting this alignment, this is what we can do to compensate for that. Let's go into a deficient posture, Lindsay. What we're going to look at here is that when she's shifting her pelvis forward, her body has the inclination of going back to that dynamic simply because she's been used to doing this for such a long time. So what the body then does when you try and institute a change by bringing it back into position, what it will typically want to do is say, you know what, we want to go back to what we've been doing already. So we're just going to go right back to this anteriorly shifted position. And so when that begins to happen, we begin to just create more of a neurological pattern. We're going to keep wiring in something that's going to be dysfunctional for us. So what we want to be very watchful of is not creating that imbalance any further. So what I'll typically do for somebody who's having a problem correcting this problem is this needs to come back. I'll bring the pelvis back. I'll have the person lean forward just maybe a little bit more. What that is, by leaning forward, what that's going to prevent is lumbar extension, which is usually the culprit behind the pelvis shifting forward. So then from there, if I just have her tilt her pelvis forward from there, so tilt it forward, there you go, hold that. That's going to kind of prevent her from beginning to lean into her hips any further. And at that point, we're not going to have to worry about the anterior pelvic shifting as much anymore. After that's been addressed and you feel that you've become comfortable with that, we can then begin to integrate the thoracic spine in conjunction with that. Something else that we may want to look for when you're trying to institute this is that your knees might begin to bend. If your knees bend, then usually what that means is you might have a tightness in your hamstrings. That's something more structurally oriented that you may want to look at with the other parts of the book. But the main things we want to be looking at in terms of the basic dynamics of this posture is, again, ankles, knees, hips, shoulders, neck, all in complete alignment. The spine is completely neutral. Navel is drawn in. Thoracic spine is extended. This is the basic dynamics of the foundations to the blueprint to your biological human body. For the next exercise, we're going to be covering a squat. To begin this, we're going to go into the dysfunctional elements of what I find with people whenever they attempt to do this exercise, and then afterwards, we're going to institute the changes needed to bring you into a more functional position. So the main things that we're going to be looking at primarily are going to be at the feet. We're going to bring the feet a little bit wider than where they're at right now. Usually when people try going into a squat, usually their feet are going to be, for one, pointing outward, so let's turn the feet outward, but then the base is going to be excessively wide. This is a very common trait that I find with most people. The reason that we don't want this is simply because now we are not getting any joint stacking. The stacking of the joints would be about right here to create a straight line. So if you were to think about grabbing a weight and bringing it above your head, it would only make sense to stack the weight from the top from the wrist to the elbow to the shoulder to the hip and have the entire body aligned. Now when we think about the body standing position, we have to think the same thing. We can't have these off angles happening, because then at that point it's going to lead to certain places compensating in ways that they shouldn't. So to begin with, again, the feet shouldn't be too far apart. After the feet have been far apart, usually what I'm going to tend to notice is that when the person comes down for the squat, let's come down for the squat. there's going to be some compensations we're going to look for here. One, the knees are going to come forward. Since I've trained her out of this, she's not going to tend to want to bring her knees forward because, you know, she knows how to operate functionally. But when somebody's dysfunctional, their knees are going to shear forward, and she's going to start putting a lot of her pressure on her toes. So this is one thing that we're going to generally tend to find. The knees may also begin to come outward, depending on the dysfunctions of the individual, and they may also begin to buckle inward. It just kind of depends on what specific structural deficiencies you have with your body. But mainly what we want to be looking at here is that the knees are probably going to be bowing outward. We'll also notice that she's going to be reaching forward. The thoracic's going to be a little bit rounded. Actually, her posture is pretty good because we've already focused on that. Let's round the posture a little more. This is probably not very good. She's probably not feeling too great right now doing this, but we'll be out of this in a second. So we'll notice that her hands are coming forward, the posture's forward. A lot of deficiencies happening here. We'll also notice that there's going to be some asymmetries happening in the body as well. So we want to be watchful of those things. So again, just looking here, hips are kind of off to the side, shoulders are rounded. A lot of bad things going on here. We want to make sure we correct that. Let's move on to the lateral view. Looking at the lateral deficiencies of what's happening in the body, again, we're always just looking at the stance. Let's bring the feet a little wider. Looking at the stance already, usually the deficiencies start from a standing position. So looking at it laterally, if the spine is already in an improper position in terms of thoracic flexion and lumbar extension, then what we're going to begin to notice is that all the deficiencies are going to manifest themselves through the movement as she comes down for the squat. So let's come down for the squat from there, Lindsay. And those manifestations are usually that she's going to have to reach forward to find a counterbalance for her hips being usually so far out of alignment. Again, like I mentioned before, we're going to be looking that most of her pressure is going to generally be on her toes, which is then going to create this shearing force of the knees kind of coming forward from here. So you'll notice that this knee begins to shoot forward, and this is going to put a lot of pressure from the femur going right into that patellar tendon. Definitely not healthy on the knees at all. Also, we'll notice like a lumbar extension going on here. So we see this curvature on the lumbar, accompanied with the curvature of the thoracic spine, an over-excessive tension of the upper cervicals. And this is usually what you will tend to find with most people when they do a squat. Occasionally, you'll find somebody that kind of drops their chest into a squat as they get into the deeper ends. That's usually a result of some kind of hip flexor tightness. So this is kind of what we're mainly going to be looking at from a side view. You may also actually see like a cervical extension of a person's head kind of coming back while they're in this position. So if you're eliciting these biomechanics, be very watchful of it because more than likely you probably are. Let's straighten the legs out. Now let's go into the posterior view. Looking at the posterior view, once again, just at the starting of the stance, we'll notice the feet turning outward here. The knees usually will tend to turn outward a slight bit. The curvatures in the lumbar, curvatures in the thoracic. So we'll come down for that squat, Lindsay. So as she's coming down here, what we might begin to notice typically is some kind of an asymmetry of the pelvis going to one side or the other. That's simply because there's not any transverse abdominis function keeping the spine completely neutral while she's in this position. So sometimes what's going to happen when the core can't function to its full capacity, the lumbar erector spinae begin to activate too much, and specifically speaking, one of the core muscles, the quadratus lumborum, will then begin to bend the spine laterally to try and stabilize for lack of usage happening in the transverse abdominis. Main thing we're also going to notice here, thoracic spine is going to be rounding, again, the head's going to be in cervical extension. Don't want any of these deficiencies happening. Also, the pressure in the toes is going to usually lead to that knee either coming outward or potentially dipping inward. So just looking for these deficiencies, we want to be certain that we're not repeating these with your own body. Let's straighten those legs out. All right, now let's look at doing this exercise correctly. All right, now we're going to go into the efficient dynamics of a proper squat. This is where it actually gets fun, and I'm not going to actually be hurting my test subject because this was definitely probably not fun for her to be doing. So what we're going to be focusing on to begin with, right off the bat, the feet have got to be straight forward from here. Let's turn that right foot just a slight bit. So right there, the feet have got to be completely straight forward, knees straight forward. We're looking at complete joint stacking happening from the ankle all the way to the shoulder. So the entire body is completely in line here. Now, what I'm going to have her doing is putting most of her pressure onto her heels to begin with. If you can think about any time that you've lifted something heavy off the ground, I assure you, you probably lifted it while you were on your heels. If you're thinking about generating strength from the sagittal plane, you want to think about driving off of the heels, specifically speaking, while we're doing the squat. So most of the pressure is going to be on the heels. As she comes down for the squat, let's go down for a squat, Lindsay. Let's keep that position. Let's pull the elbows back. As she comes down for the squat, you'll notice that the knees are going to maintain their position. The legs are going to stay in the sagittal plane. There's going to be no frontal plane shifting happening there. The knees are completely centered right there. This is ensuring that we're getting support from the abductors, which will then be crucial for gluteal activation as she comes upward. The last thing we want, let's finish out the squat. Let's come up. Last thing we want when she comes upward for the squat is the knees to begin to rotate outward. So when she keeps the knees inward, what that's promoting is an associated contraction of the abductors, the inner parts of the thigh, in conjunction with the gluteus maximus. We want them working together. Let's hit the bottom of that squat again. We hold that position. The knees are pretty much in line here. The navel is also going to be drawn in. Let's bring the chest up a little bit higher. Let's rotate the pelvis posteriorly a slight bit. Hold that. Now let's extend that thoracic spine. Well, now, as you see here, the posture is nice and open on the upper body. The traps are nice and relaxed. The arms don't have to come forward in compensation anymore, simply because the rest of her body is put together. So if you get all the dynamics happening in the rest of the body, usually the arms won't have to come too far forward. So this is mainly what we're going to notice on the front side of the body that needs to get corrected. Now let's move on to the lateral side. Looking at the lateral end of the body right here, we're going to notice that the ankles, the knees, the hips, the shoulders, and the neck are going to be in a completely straight line. So to begin with, she's already at a phenomenal posture. You'll notice that everything is already straight. In order for us to have a good ending, we have to have a good beginning. And if we look at the entire structure here, the entire thing is just looking really, really good right now. So now let's come down into that squat, Lindsay. As she comes down, you'll notice that the knees are going to come slightly forward, and that's perfect. Because at this point, she doesn't really have a support structure for the knees, so the body oftentimes has to compensate with a slight bit of shearing. Again, excessive shearing is not what we're looking for. Right here, her knees are probably not going to cross her toes, so that's really going to be like the barrier that we want to look at. Let's straighten out the legs again. Let's come down for the squat again. But we're also going to notice that as she gets to the bottom of the squat, the pelvis is going to be going into flexion. When the pelvis loads in flexion, what then that's going to promote is posterior tilt as she comes upward. So let's straighten the legs out. So she goes flexion and then goes posterior tilt into the pelvis. When she gets to the top, you'll notice she gets to the neutral spine, and the thoracic spine is also in extension. Let's come down again. Pressure is on the heels. We want to ensure that we're on the heels. A good way to test that she's on the heels is, let's put pressure on the toes a little bit. I'll just tell her, okay, begin to tap your toes. So she taps her toes, tap them nice and high. So lift the toes up. That'll kind of force her to get onto her heels. So if you're looking for a way to get a person off of their toes or get yourself off your toes, just kind of tap them, and then that should automatically bring you onto the heels. Another thing we'll generally notice here, if she's in a pretty good alignment, is that typically her torso should be in alignment with the shin bone. Let's pull the pelvis back a slight bit. So we should notice that a similar angle happening between the torso and the shin bones. So we'll have to actually bring the posture upright a little bit more here. The knees can come a little further forward. The thoracic spine extends a little more. Let's retract that scapula. So right here we're looking at relatively parallel angles happening at the shin bone and at the torso. We'll also look at her neck. It's in beautiful alignment here. Look, everything looks great. Let's sway your lower back here a little bit. Let's go the other way. I want you to go wrong. That's what we don't want out of the lumbar. Let's go slight posterior tilt. Let's draw the navel in. If we bring the arms forward just to kind of reveal what's going on, you'll see that her TVA is highly active here. Let's come down a little lower into the squat. Let's stay on the heels. She's probably dying here because at this point she's really firing off all the muscles. But right here her core is becoming very active. Let's straighten out the legs. She is very advanced, and was that very easy right now? At this point, it's a very challenging exercise to do once you start doing everything correctly, because she's aligning all those structural centers together. Keep in mind that if you live in a structurally deficient environment where you're sitting down, as she does, and as we all do, you're likely going to end up having to battle your own dysfunctions to hold those positions. So just doing something like this with proper alignment will give you a workout in and of itself. Let's come down for that squat again. Again, let's not try and bring the elbows too far forward. About right there is good. She can even bring it back to about here. We'll retract the scapula from there. Let's come down a little lower. So you'll notice right there the pelvis is dropping back. We'll straighten the legs out. Tuck the glutes under. And bang, she's nailing that sucker pretty darn well. Alignment's happening everywhere. Geometry, some nice good geometry happening throughout the body. Let's move on into the posterior end of the body. Analyzing the posterior end of the body, once again, we're looking at joint stacking everywhere. So we'll look at the shoulders, hips, knees, ankles. As I mentioned before, the Achilles tendon is fairly straight. Most of the pressure is going to be on the heels. T-spine is intact. She's already at a great base before we start the exercise. That's essential for us to be able to move on through this movement. So now we're going to come down into a squat. Since her navel is in, we're also going to notice that her spine should be actually relatively neutral. There should be no swaying happening here. We're going to notice a nice thoracic spine in place. We'll notice that there's no shifting happening in one direction or the other. Even if I push her to one side, it's automatically counter stabilizes and she's in place. So there's no movement happening back and forth because she's in such a good position. The main things we're looking for here, the main ones that we'll find when she's efficient is, again, that the legs are completely straightforward, the knees aren't bowing outward too far. Something you want to keep in mind is that you might want to feel some tension in the hamstring, a slight tug there, but then that's going to promote, it's kind of a posterior tilt. Let's come to the top of the squat. Hold that position. As she comes up to the end of the squat, she goes right back into her standing position. Let's come down into the squat again. Pelvic flexion, spine stays neutral. And let's come up. And good. Now let's take this into the executed version. Going into the explanation of this exercise in real time, let's come down. We're going to be going down and up on the squat. Again, we're looking at the knees not bowing outward or inward. Let's bring them in a little bit further. So the knees are going to be completely straight forward. The navel is going to be drawn in. Let's straighten out the body. So let's come down and up. Again, looking at the thoracic spine being maintained the entire time. Her pec muscles are completely opened up because her scapula is retracted. We'll see that navel. Again, just look, notice the navel being drawn in. Most of the time, people's stomachs are going to want to hang out as they get to the bottom due to poor abdominal recruitment happening in the body. So the scapula is going to remain back. We straighten out the legs. So all the joints are lining up here. Cervical spine's in beautiful alignment too. The elbows are back. There's no compensations of the arms coming forward from here. So everything's looking really great from here. The pressure's on the heels. Again, not on the toes, on the heels. Let's give ourselves a nice little lateral view here. So as we're coming downward, the knees slightly shear forward, and that's going to be okay for them to slightly shear forward. And we're primarily going to be leading off the glutes. The primary place where we should be feeling most of the function happening here is going to be at the bottom of the contraction, where within the hamstrings. As we get to the top is when we'll begin to feel the gluteus maximus begin to fire. So at the bottom it's the hammies, at the top we get the glutes working. So this is going to be a great glute developer. If you are feeling your quadriceps work way too much, what that's going to be an indicator of is that your hip flexors are becoming too tight, and what that means is that you're going to get an overusage of this muscle called your rectus femoris. That's a muscle on the front side of the hips. That may be a muscle that you may need to release, but regardless, what you really can do is almost focus on when you get to the bottom of the squat is relaxing the quads as much as possible and trying to initiate more tension onto the hamstrings. Okay, noticing here, she's on her heels. Keeping the chest up a little higher, draw that navel in, getting a little too much sway going on here. Good, and we straighten the legs out. Coming down again. Again, dropping that butt back, really focusing on getting those gluteus maximus muscles working and getting them loaded into position. No reaching forward on the hands, the scapula is retracted. This really looks great. Let's get a posterior view going here. So again, posterior end, there's no shifting happening asymmetrically from one leg to the other. You'll see that there's no changes in the spinal structure. Pressure again is on the heels. The legs are pointing straight forward. Okay, let's coming down for the squat. So all the joints are moving in that sagittal plane. There's no frontal plane movement happening in the lower extremities. Noticing that scapula, again, good, great retraction happening right here. Noticing that straightness right here. So there's no pressure happening in the lumbar vertebrae simply because there's support happening at the opposite extremes, which is going to be at the transverse abdominis as it's holding the spine together. And then we're also getting that support system from the thoracic spine along with that. Great execution. All right, that is a squat. Now we're going to move on into the next exercise. For the next exercise, we're going to be covering another popular one. It's going to be called a lunge. So we're going to be looking at the deficiencies first, and then we're going to be moving on into the efficient ways of actually doing the biomechanically correct lunge. This is a very, very useful exercise for developing, again, gluteal function, the hamstring function, and quadricep function in integration. So this is going to be a great leg exercise, but it's only going to be a great leg exercise if we use it with proper integrated mechanics. So right now what we're going to do is cover the deficiencies that we'll commonly find when somebody's doing a lunge, and then from there we'll move on into the good stuff later. Looking at an anterior view of the body right here as she's going into a lunge, right off the bat we're looking that her posture is probably going to be completely off to begin with. Usually what people will normally do when they do a lunge is actually bring their feet closer together. This is bring all the way together. People will actually bring their feet really, really close together, and what then that's going to create is some other muscular compensations that I'll be explaining here in a minute. So let's go into what a person's traditional lunge would be, and this is going to be just for the anterior view. So we're going to step forward. Typically, on this side, we're not going to see much of what's happening in the knee. I'm kind of just going to be here to support her, but the knee is going to be driving forward, and oftentimes what will happen too is the shifting of the pelvis going out to one side. Let's come back. Let's take a little break. The pelvis is going to shift over to the side as she does this. The reason I'm kind of giving her a break is because this is just a really, really bad way of doing this, and I trained her out of this, so I don't want her continually doing this kind of movement because it can be really bad on the knee. So the key point is that you'll probably notice that as she steps forward, that the hips are going to drop off this way, and that her hips will shoot in that direction when she steps forward. Also, since she's more linear, bring your feet closer together. As she steps forward, we have to understand, let's take a step forward. Hold that, and you don't have to come down too low. Let's go a little straight. As she steps forward, since her feet are more narrow than her pelvis, that's automatically going to create a shifting of the pelvis based upon the fact that she can no longer stack her joints. If she's on these lines, then that would make it different. But right now, since her feet are right here parallel in a straight line, her hips are going to have to compensate to one direction or the other. So automatically, we'll notice these primary asymmetrical dysfunctions as she's coming back. Let's come back into your regular stance. So we don't want any of that kind of stuff happening, but this is what you're normally going to see out of most people when they do a lunge. And the main thing that you'll notice out of the front view of the body is going to be that deficiency. Is again, the hips are going to shoot outward. Most of the deficiencies that we're going to notice, however, are going to generally be seen on the lateral view more than anything else. Looking at the lateral view of what's happening with the body right here, which is coming forward into a lunge, we're going to understand that we have to understand that if her stance is already off, she's going to have some dysfunctions that are going to come forward. So let's step forward from here. As she comes forward, I'm going to be supporting her knee so it doesn't bother her. Her femur is going to begin to drive into her patellar tendon right here on the anterior portion of her knee. And that's going to usually lead to some real bad stuff happening right here at this region, and there's not much muscular support happening in this spot. So this is a common problem with most people when they do a lunge. Let's come back. So we want to be very watchful that that knee does not come forward. Now, a way that somebody will generally compensate for that to ensure the knee doesn't come forward after they've learned that's a bad habit is that they'll just take a really long step. So let's take a really long step there. And from there, what that'll generally tend to promote, let's try keeping the knee back. That'll kind of generally tend to promote a 90-degree angle being created at the legs. The only problem is because she's taking such a long step forward, her lateral stability is going to be completely thrown off from there. So she won't have very much strength moving laterally. Let's come back. But if you notice right here, I have these two lines on the floor. What these two lines are going to represent are the positions where she's going to be stacking her joints while she's going into this movement. So when she steps forward, we want to be looking towards stacking the joints. But not only that, we're going to be almost operating within the confines of a box. So if we look at the balls of her feet here, we'll be looking for her to be stepping about to about this distance, so that when she lands her foot in this place, she's going to be almost creating a square. So at that point now we're looking at stacking the joints. What then that's going to promote is a three-dimensional stability that you wouldn't get out of a traditional lunge. So we're not going to get that right now. We'll be getting that more when we do the proper execution of the mechanics. But what I just want you to be aware of at this given point is that when a person's stepping forward and doing it improperly, let's bring the feet closer together, step forward, is an anterior shearing. We got to get rid of that. This is one thing that you got to be very watchful of because it's a very damaging behavior. Let's come back. Also, another thing that you might notice when a person comes forward is that when they step forward, they also put a lot of pressure on the toe, which then aggravates that knee even further than what it normally would. So most of the time when people are in that position, they're putting the pressure on the toe, and they're not going to be able to handle that as they're coming forward in that position. Another thing we'll notice that as she steps forward, there's going to be a big dysfunction with is that her lumbar is going to have a curvature as she steps forward. So let's take that forward step, hold that position, and you don't have to come down too low. But typically, especially if somebody knows that, you know what, you're supposed to have a good posture, usually what they'll do is they'll tend to dip into the curve of their posture, which then drives that knee even further, and then it becomes even more damaging on that knee up front. So let's come back again. So we want to be very watchful of those dynamics, because those are the main ones that are going to happen with the body as she begins to come forward. Looking at a posterior angle of the body, again, we're noticing that rounded thoracic, that swayed lumbar region. We're noticing the feet becoming close together. What's really going to reveal here is the movement of her pelvis as she steps forward. You're going to begin to notice a lot of sways happening back and forth as she's going into movement, stepping forward. We do not want that happening. We want this to be completely flat as she steps forward. But when she's in deficiency, that's when the QLs right here are going to start activating, and the next thing you know, her quadratus lumborum muscles are going to take over. So I want you stepping forward from there, Lindsay. So the main thing is you'll see the hip begin to shift over. We'll come back. Let's step forward again. Again, hip shifts over, and we'll come back, and we'll step forward with the left leg. Hips begin to shoot in that direction, and that's the common pattern that we'll see here, and you'll see that kinetic dysfunction that then will travel up the rest of the body. Let's come back. The main compensator, the main joint that's going to take the brunt of the load when this exercise is being done are probably going to be the knees. So these regions are going to take a beating when that's happening. Again, let's take a step forward. Another thing that I'm going to reiterate is the alignment of the legs, that they're too narrow. So when I push her this way, she's completely off balance. There's no way that she can stabilize herself from there, because now her joints are not stacked. Also, let's come back. Also, when the joints are not stacked, what then that's going to promote is more curvatures here, which then is going to shunt the activity of the transverse abdominis. We need this to be completely straight. So if we're in this position, that promotes a curvature happening one way or the other. Then at that point, it inhibits us from being able to really draw in that neutral spine. So again, be very, very watchful of this dysfunction happening with the feet being closer together. Looking at a structurally efficient lunge from the anterior view, we're already going to notice straight geometric lines and joint stacking happening everywhere while she's just before she's even going to begin this exercise. So what I want her doing here, we're going to take a step forward. We're going to see the continuation of that. We'll see the knee, the ankle, the hips, the shoulders are again completely in line with these lines that I have put on the floor here. So you'll see that there's a complete alignment here. So now you'll also notice that her core is going to be drawn in as she's doing that, and then from there you'll also see that her posture is completely opened up on the upper part of her body. From there we're going to press on the leg, coming backward and come back to the neutral stance. So now she's back into her alignment. We're going to step forward with your left leg. Joint stacking everywhere. Most of her pressure is going to be on her heels. You may not be able to see the influence of why that's important right now in terms of it being in the anterior position. The main thing I want you guys looking at is the relation of her feet and her entire body in conjunction with these lines here and how everything's stacked. Very important thing is really, really stable as she's there, because now she can fight forces happening laterally as well as sagittally as she's moving here. So there's no direction she can't move from here. So this is a very important loaded position here. We'll come back. Let's take a step forward. Excellent. Spine neutral. Thoracic is extended. This is a very unorthodox way of looking at a lunge, but this is how a lunge needs to actually be done. This is the most integrated version of a lunge that you can do. Again, every single plane of motion can be implemented from this lunge. This is one of the most important positionings that you can master as a human being. Looking at the structural efficiency of the movement happening from the lateral view, I'm going to have Lindsay stepping forward from here. We'll notice that the knee is not going to drag over the ankle. Under a structurally deficient posture or just deficient biomechanic, this is going to be coming beyond the ankle. We have to make sure that this is back. Since we have a support structure, now there's no, from the back foot, now there's no reason to allow the knee to shear forward. Also, we'll notice that this heel is not coming back, because even when somebody tries aligning these mechanics, they usually bring this foot back, and that ends up putting too much pressure on the rear quadricep. So we lift that back heel off the ground, put most of the pressure on the front leg, then from there we press off that left leg, and that brings us back to our neutral standing position. If we look at her posture up here, again, it's maintaining. We're going to step forward with the left leg this time. We hold that. Spine is completely neutral here. She's going to drop her chest forward slightly to compensate, so that way we can kind of build hip extension in this region. So this is completely neutral. We drive off of that heel and come back. Beautiful. We'll step forward with the right leg. Excellent mechanics. You see that heel lifting off the ground. Very little pressure on that back foot, so that should be able to come up. So now we're noticing a nice neutral posture. Most of the pressure is on that right leg, so we're loading that right glute and that right hamstring. We come back, maintain the thoracic spine. We'll step forward with the left leg. Spine is neutral. Let's drop that pelvis back on the right side. So we want to set it into slight flexion on the left side here, so we load that entire posterior chain up. We press off that leg. Step forward with the right leg. Pressing off the heel, guys. Make sure you don't get on the toes. Pressure is off of the heel here. We drive off that heel and bring it back. And once you get this executed correctly, you should be feeling a significant amount of tension in that posterior chain, in the hamstrings, and in the glutes. Looking at a posterior view of this lunge, again, we're looking at alignment with these lines happening down here. These two parallel lines are going to be kind of the base point of understanding our efficiency. As she steps forward, not like the deficient way of doing it, we're going to notice that her pelvis is going to be completely square off. It's not going to dip to one side or the other. We should notice that this should be able to maintain itself completely, especially if she's getting neutral spine dynamics, and especially if she's stacking her joints. It's when the feet get inside that the hip will usually, inside the lines, that the hips will start to sway to one side or the other. So let's take a step forward here, Lindsay. We'll notice that for the most part, there's no real shifting that's happening here. We're noticing that everything is square. The thoracic spine is completely intact. We press back. Good. We come forward. We notice that plantar flexion happening right there on the opposite leg. Let's pull this left leg back a little bit more. So hinge the hips back on the left side. Draw the navel in. We're noticing those hips become very square. We press off that left heel and come back. Beautiful. Coming forward. So now at this point, again, if I press from the side, super stable. Now she's able to fight the forces happening laterally in case she needs to. We come back, hold that position, coming back right to that neutral posture. Let's retract that scapula a little further, make sure that we're maintaining that. Again, we do not want to let go of that neutral spine. We have to keep the navel in the entire time to ensure that we don't get those overcompensations happening at those quadratus lumborum muscles. If we load the transverse abdominis, there's no reason for this erector spinae region to take the brunt of the load during this exercise. We step forward again. Hips are staying primarily neutral. We need to hinge this left hip back a little further. Good. Draw the navel in. We press off that left leg. Step forward with the right leg. And beautiful. Let's go into the application of this exercise now. Looking at the application of this exercise, what we primarily want to focus most of our attention towards is the gluteus maximus. That's the primary mover that should be driving our entire lower body as we're going through this exercise, as well as most of the lower body exercises that we have going. If you're not feeling the tension here, it's likely that you're probably overloading the quadriceps, maybe the calves and the lower back. We don't want those areas working because it's likely that they're already overworking to begin with. So now we're going to be covering the application of this. Let's take a step forward, Lindsay. She's driving off of her heel here. She presses back off of her heel, and that brings her back into her stance. We step forward with the left, pressing off of the heel. Then she drives back. Beautiful, coming forward. So if she was on her toe, more than likely what might happen is that knee may want to come forward. If the knee comes forward, then the hip wants to sag over. We don't want that. So pull the pelvis back on the right side, stay on the heel, drive off the heel. Bam, that's a nice neutral spine happening there. Let's flip around from there. So as we start looking at the body from a lateral view, again, we step forward from there. The knee is not dragging over the ankle. Beautiful alignment. We'll see that plantar flexion happening on the right side. You'll almost notice that foot's completely vertical. Let's drive off of that leg. She presses off. She's got all kinds of power coming off of that. Let's take a step forward. So there's lots of strength happening here. The entire body is loaded. The thoracic spine is an extension. She's loading that hamstring. She should feel some tension off of that. We press off that right hammy. Bingo. Let's go with that left leg. Coming back. Excellent job. Coming back. Again, keep going. The quality of movement when doing an exercise like this is the most important element of all exercise. Oftentimes we get so caught up in wanting to just feel really, really tired while we do an exercise to know that we're actually getting a positive effect. What we have to think about when doing anything is that we're doing a high quality, so that way it translates into when you're doing something in reality. This also goes hand in hand when looking at the digestive system, when looking at the nervous system. A body that's operating efficiently will be more inclined to be healthy. It'll be more inclined to stay lean. It'll be pain-free. It'll have energy. So by doing things like this and being very intentional of our biomechanics, we're setting the foundation up to a structurally efficient body that is not going to be in compensation. Let's step forward again. Also, this is going to be the foundation of doing other exercises like plyo step lunges, us using kettlebell swings with lunges, and that's where we really start getting into some fun stuff. Right now, we're in the foundation building stage, and we'll move on to the more fun stuff later on in this entire exercise system. For the next exercise, we're going to be covering a medicine ball slam. Now, I really like this exercise myself because it really trains the eccentric loads of what happened in a squat. So let's say if I was going to jump upward, when I hit the downward phase of a squat, it would help me with the deceleration of me coming downward. Oftentimes what happens with people when they come down into a squat is when they land, their knees will tend to come forward. If you train the body away from that and learn to exert force, by slamming the ball downward, what that does is then begins to promote an activation of all the systems that will help you land into a proper position when you're at the bottom of the squat. So this is a fantastic exercise for developing that. Beyond that, it's great for developing dynamic elasticity of the lats, but then also great for core activation as well as hamstring function as you're coming down, slamming that ball. So it's really good for the entire body. Looking at a structurally deficient biomechanical pattern when somebody's going into a medicine ball slam, what we're going to notice right off the bat is that the feet are going to be really far apart and then the toes are going to be pointed outward. Again, it's untraining the lower extremities to work on the sagittal plane when they need to in this specific position. So automatically, that's going to be a problem when it comes to the body. Another thing we'll also notice that let's try reaching up with the ball. Well, you'll notice out of a person, she's actually doing a really good job of right here to not do, is that you'll notice that a shrugging of the shoulders might begin to happen. So what it'll look like when it's the opposite of this, she'll actually bring the ball down a little lower, and I want you to shrug your traps. You'll notice that when somebody brings the ball above their head, they'll begin to overutilize their upper traps. That's usually a result of tight lats happening here. Again, it's another structural thing that we won't really cover, but it's just something to keep in mind. Let's bring the ball back down. So when she brings the ball above her head, she may begin to round her traps coming upward. Another thing you'll also notice, let's bring the hands up above your head, is she's deficient. Since she can't bring her hands up above her head, she'll then have to compensate with her lumbar to bring the ball back this way. And you'll notice like a pooch coming out right here, let go of your stomach. You almost notice like an elongation happening right here in the lower abdomen as she's there, and that'll be really bad on the lower back. You won't be able to see that from this angle, but just be mindful of those abdominals being elongated from there. Let's go down into the slam from there. So we're just going to slam that about right here. When she slams downward, what we might notice is an inward or outward rotation of the knees as she's coming forward. We'll also notice like a lot of tension happening in the upper body as she's doing it. Let's straighten the legs out. Another common trait that will happen is I don't want you to bend, I want you to just use your arms and slam the ball down. So we'll slam the ball down. So you can slam it on the ground. So what will actually happen is that when she slams the ball down, most of the time when people do it, since they've never learned to build kinetic energy with their lower body, reach up with the ball, when they slam it, they'll actually just freeze their body and just slam it with the upper body. not knowing that what the whole purpose of this exercise is to make it an integrated movement. So as she does that, what she's just really doing is just tightening her lats a whole heck of a lot more than what she needs to. Come down. So that's going to be another problem that often tends to happen with people, that they'll just use their upper body when it comes to doing this movement. We don't want that. We're trying to integrate the entire system to make it more efficient. Looking at a lateral dysfunction from here, I'm going to have you lifting your hands up, Lindsay. As she raises up, let's try shrugging the shoulders. And then from there, you're going to start leaning back with your upper body. We'll notice this leaning back that happens to people because they're incapable of reaching up with their hands. Let's bend the elbows, shrug up the shoulders. This is usually what you'll commonly see is this lumbar extension that happens as she's doing that. I want you to then slam the ball downward. And normally what happens is you'll use her upper body. If she does use her lower body, what will typically happen is her knees are going to come forward in this direction as she slams it. So let's slam. And the knees tend to come forward. She actually looks pretty good doing it. She's probably not the best at giving an example of this because I untrained her of what she used to do. So when she slams it, let's go into a very slow version of it. When she slams it, it comes down slow. The knees will actually, rather than her hips scooting back, her knees will come forward in this direction. She puts all the pressure on her toes, and that's what ends up becoming the compensating pattern. Let's bring the ball back up. Let's slam it down. Good, and that's usually what the ending posture. Another thing that I'll notice out of people is that when they hold the ball, hold it in front of you, they'll start to round their posture because they're holding it away from them. Don't hold the ball away from you. You'll more than likely want to hold it closer to you. Otherwise, we're going to notice this compensating pattern. Another curvature happening here as she's coming down into that downward phase of the slam. Let's come up. She leans back, and then from there she slams. Knees come forward, and that's usually what will happen if she's doing it properly. Also, again, be watchful of that. This is do the upper body slam. Be very watchful that you don't find yourself doing this one either, because this is the main one that people will do when they do a medicine ball slam. Again, this is not building any form of efficiency with the body. We're pretty much just overtraining the systems of the shoulder, which don't need any more training like that altogether. Also, looking at the body, we'll notice that there's very poor joint stacking. The ankles, knees, hips, shoulders, all the stuff I've mentioned before, all those same geometrical misalignments are happening within this view. Let's move on to the posterior view. Okay, looking at the posterior view, let's bring the hands up. Again, shrugging the traps, extending the lumbar, feet are pointed outward, lots of good stuff just going wrong here. Let's slam that ball downward. Again, she's just using her upper body there, not really much efficiency going on in terms of biomechanics as she's going here. Now let's use the legs on this one. She comes forward, the knees may begin to buckle outward or buckle inward. There's all kinds of different problems that will begin to happen from there. Let's come back again. If we really begin to analyze, hold that position. Let's try bending the elbows and then shrugging the shoulders up. This is what we're going to begin to see out of people primarily because they have those tight lats and they're not able to get that full range of motion. We'll see the shrugging of the shoulders accompanied by the swaying of the lumbar. Definitely not good. Definitely things to be watchful of because it's likely that your body might do that when it's into a dysfunctional position. Let's take a break. Looking at an anterior view of efficient biomechanics on a medicine ball slam, what we're going to be noticing here is as she's raising up with her hands, she's getting a nice stretch out of the lats, the spine's still neutral, she's getting to the balls of her feet, and then as she comes downward, she's going to drop down to her heels and drop her butt back. Again, looking at all the postural dynamics, I think the knees could probably be used to be a little closer together, so let's bring them a little closer together. So the knees could be a little closer together, and that's about the only real thing that we could correct. But her posture looks great, her finishing movement looks awesome. It really just looks like the bottom of a squat for the most part. As she, let's go back into that squat. As she brings it towards her, back towards her, what I want her to do is bring this close and then use her legs to bring the ball upward above her head. So we're going to go there, she brings it up, then she comes down, and then she slams. So we're noticing, again, good efficient biomechanics. Spine is neutral, thoracic spine is the extension. The pecs are nice and open. Let's retract that scapula a little more. The pecs are nice and open from there. She's in a great position here. These are going to be the main things that we'll notice right here on the front side of the body. Now we're going to cover the lateral view. Looking at the lateral view of an efficient medicine ball slam, again, let's go down into a squat from there, Lindsay. She's going to be bringing this close to her body. Then from there, after she brings it close to her body, she's going to use her legs to bring the ball above her head. Her spine is relatively neutral from here. Draw the navel in. Then from there, she's going to shoot her hips back, land on the heels, and then slam the ball. You notice the knees are not shearing forward as she's in this position. She has a pretty good posture, maybe a little too much lumbar curvature, so let's correct that, Lindsay. Good, so now she just drew her TBA, which helped a significant amount. We'll come back up with that slam. Come up, coming down, and you'll notice that as she's not going to try and muscle this thing downward. She's going to wait for momentum to kind of carry upward, and then after that, she's going to slam the ball downward. And so she waits up, waits for the ball, for the momentum to stop. She comes up, waits for the momentum, now she slams, and see, it becomes a nice rhythmic movement. What then that's going to do is stretch out the rectus abdominis to a small regard, which is then going to promote that slamming of the ball to come downward. So we come up, coming down, beautiful job. Coming up and down, hinging the hips back, beautiful. Once again, spine is going to be neutral, thoracic is an extension. You'll notice those knees are not going to pass too far over the ankles. All the alignments that we had mentioned before within a squat are really going to apply as we're finishing out this exercise. We'll go again one more time. She straightens out the legs, getting to the top. Then from there, she drops her butt back, slams onto the heels, and she's in right there in position. Once again, looking at the medicine ball slam from an efficient dynamic, we're looking at all the joints stacking. So we look at the shoulders, the hips, the knees, and the ankles. Everything is completely stacking. Let's come down for that squat. When she comes down to the loaded phase of the medicine ball slam, and then let's come to the top. You'll notice that through the whole range of motion, all the joints are stacking. We come down, so there's no change in that. You'll notice that all the joints are moving straight forward and straight back from there. We come up, hold that. And you can come down to your heels. Now we're going to look at the function of the upper trapezius. We'll notice that there's not much activity going on up here. It's mainly the lower trap stabilizing the thoracic spine from here, and that she's not overusing those upper traps. Whereas before she was shrugging upward, now we've eliminated that because all the spinal structures are in place. Let's drop the hips back and then slam. Boom. And see, now everything is in place. There's no excessive tension on the upper body, and that looks really, really good. Let's come up again. We reach up, depression of the scapula, then from there drops her onto her heels, slams. Good. Go again. One more time. And good. Now let's look at the applied version of this exercise. Now we're going to run through the applied version of a medicine ball slam in an efficient manner. So we're going to be coming down into a squat, holding that position, pulling the navel in, keeping those elbows in tight. Now we're going to reach up with the ball, using the legs. We go to the toes, drop back down to the heels, and then slam the ball. Excellent job. You'll see, again, great control, great center of gravity. There's never a point where she's really off balance. You'll see her upper body is nice and relaxed. Not a lot of tension happening in that upper body. She's holding everything true. If she wants to slam it to herself, she can slam it to about right here, and then from there you can reach down and grab it. Excellent. We hinge the hips back at the bottom of the slam, and you can go. We'll go again. Spine is neutral. Let's give us a nice little lateral view here. You'll notice again the rhythm of all of it. As she comes up, she waits for it. Then as the momentum begins to come downward, as gravity begins to take force onto the ball, she waits off of the momentum from the medicine ball, then she slams the ball downward. That's a key point. Hinging the hips back a little more there, Lindsay. Let's get back to his heels a little further. Much better there. So you notice that there's a much more efficient slam. Remember, the kinetic energy builds at the legs, at the hamstrings, and at the core. So we have to really try and get the lower body integrated into this with the upper body. But most of the force should be coming from the lower body. The upper body should act more as a dynamic structure rather than acting as some kind of a structure to ensue strength when doing the movement. So the upper body follows the lower body, and we will be good to go. For the next exercise, we're going to be covering a plank. My main goal, or my main objective with this exercise is that we're going to be focusing on developing intrinsic core stability within the inner unit of the abdominal wall. Now, there's going to be other core muscles that are going to be responsible for dynamic movement. We're not concerned with that with this specific exercise. So the main muscle we want to focus on while we're doing this is going to be the transverse abdominis, which means there's going to be some focal points that we have to look at biomechanically to ensure that we set the transverse abdominis into a position where it will be able to work effectively. So this is not going to be anything where we want to incorporate movement. We want to be very rigid. And now what we're going to do is go into the deficiencies of what is found usually with the plank, and then we're going to go into what a biomechanically clean plank should look like. All right, a few of the deficiencies we want to generally look for are going to be located within the thoracic spine and in the lumbar spine. Usually what we're going to tend to find are curvatures that happen in the mid-back and curvatures that happen in the lower back. And these are really going to be the manifestations of what happened in the standing posture. And then once we put the body into a loaded situation where we have to activate the intrinsic core stabilization system is when we'll see these movements really begin to protrude outward during the plank. So this is more than likely what you're going to find. So let's go into that plank, Mike. So what we'll usually find is there's going to be a huge rounding here. The hips are usually going to be lower than the shoulders. So let's drop the hips lower. So if the hips are mispositioned, usually what you'll find is this jagged curvature happening in the lumbar spine. Let's round a little further, protract the shoulders at the top. There you go. It's really hard for him to do this simply because I've kind of trained him out of this, but this is what he was doing initially when we first started training. So this is generally what you're going to find out of most people when they're doing their plank. This is the main dysfunction that we're going to be looking at. Take a little break here. Main reason this is going to be happening is that there's an overdevelopment of the upper abdominal tissues of the rectus abdominis, and there's an elongation of the lower abdominis. So when we get that rounding of the thoracic, it means that the curvature up here is becoming dominant because this is pulling everything downward. At the lower portions, since it's elongated, you're going to get the sway. So that's why we got to get that dual curvature where we get the thoracic rounding as well as the lumbar. Let's give him another shot of that, Mike. So again, the hips are generally going to be lower. So the hips will usually be beneath the shoulders. So when they're beneath the shoulders, it's automatically going to promote that curvature. So it's the positioning of the hips that will usually cause this. And that's usually what's going to create a lot of excessive tension right here in the lumbar spine. We'll also usually notice a forward head that comes off of here and an excessive tension that comes into the upper trapezius muscles. So we definitely want to be watchful of these types of mechanics because it's likely that you'll probably be eliciting that simply because these are the kind of mechanics that will be elicited from a person that's in a dysfunctional environment. If we look at the feet in this situation, oftentimes what we're also going to find is an external rotation of the hips, which means that the heels will generally come together, which that means that since the glutes are not able to function on a primary operation, whenever you do try incorporating gluteal activation during a plank, the heels may come together. So that's something else that you may begin to elicit within your own structural elements in terms of your movement and your stability. So be very watchful of that as well. You definitely want those ankles to be straight, but under a dysfunctional environment, those ankles will probably be, or those heels will be a little bit closer together. Analyzing the proper biomechanics of a plank, we want to be looking at the relation of the shoulder to the elbow. We want these to be one right on top of the other so that way it is in a safe position. After looking at that, what we also want to look at is the relation of the thoracic spine with the lumbar spine and seeing that we have a nice flat surface here to work with before we actually go into the exercise. So as we see here, you'll see his thoracic spine is extended. He's getting great scapular retraction, which is helping us stabilize the shoulder. But then he's also drawing the navel inward, which is enabling us to straighten the spine completely at that lumbar region so we don't put any excessive pressure. From there, what I'll be having Mike do is actually straighten out his legs. Crucial that we maintain the alignment of the pelvis with the shoulders. If the hips sag down, let's sag down from there. It is going to be virtually impossible to rotate the pelvis under when we're trying to go into a plank. So the pelvis has to come up, then we're going to rotate the pelvis posteriorly from there. You'll see there's kind of like a tucking going on. And usually to begin with, what you may need to get that core function is a contraction of the glutes. So right here, Mike should be activating his glutes to begin with. After you've gotten that mastered over the course of a few months or maybe a course of a few weeks, your hip flexors may not be so tight, which is what's making you having to use your glutes in this situation. And then at that point, you can actually relax the glutes. So let's relax the glutes, Mike. And then we're going to draw in the navel and rotate posteriorly. So now he's just going to be utilizing his transverse abdominis to stabilize the spine. That's the end goal when we're doing this exercise, and that's what's going to enable us to really develop that intrinsic core stabilization from here. Take a little break from there. So again, be very, very wary that you don't go into that thoracic rounding and that lumbar curvature. Always focus on the pelvic positioning first. If the hips are down lower than the shoulders, it is likely you're going to promote that lumbar curvature. We want the hips to be about level with the shoulders, and then from there, we go into that posterior tilt. So we always get that posterior tilt after the hips are level. So if that's low, it is virtually impossible to get that function. Let's give it another shot. Okay, so the thoracic is extended. The hips are about level with the shoulders. Let's retract that scapula a little further. So we see that nice alignment coming over the top. It's almost, if I put a stick right here, you'll see that everything would be in line. His cervical spine is in beautiful position there. His shoulders are stacking right over the elbows. If we look back here at the feet, we'll also notice that everything is completely vertical, so we're not getting any of that external rotation. Everything is pretty much straight. So everything is in alignment. We have really, really good dynamics coming on here. The navel's retracted inward, so the stomach isn't hanging out. We're really getting a good efficient plank here. He's starting to get some fatigue, so we'll stop it from there, okay? Something to watch for when you're doing this plank is that you do not elicit poor biomechanics when doing it. If you are, you're just going to start building in more dysfunctional movement patterns for later on. So we don't want to promote any deficient postures while doing this. Once I begin to see somebody's mechanics begin to wear out is immediately when I stop them. As long as you can maintain your mechanics, you can go as long as you want during the exercise. But if those curvatures pop up, stop immediately. So right now I notice a little bit of fatigue and more of a curvature happening in his lumbar and a rounding in that thoracic. So that's where I'll usually limit that exercise. The next exercise we're going to be covering will be a side lunge. This is going to be bringing us into the frontal plane. The last few exercises that we have done were in the sagittal plane. This is going to move us laterally. There's going to be quite a few deficiencies that happen with the body when you're going to move laterally. I'm going to cover that right now. Looking at the anterior view of a side lunge, we're going to be noticing a few deficiencies where there's going to be like lateral shifts in the knee. As I have Mike right here going into the exercise, you're going to probably notice like a forward burgeoning of the body and the arms kind of extending outward. These are the biggest commonalities I find with people whenever I put them on a side lunge. So now we're going to cover this bit by bit. So let's go into the side lunge going to your left right here, Mike. So if he's doing, right now he's going to be doing a pretty good job. I've kind of trained him out of doing poor mechanics, but usually what's going to happen is like there's going to be a rounding of the thoracic and you'll notice excessive tension here. He'll be lifting his head up in this direction and you usually reach forward in compensation because the center of gravity is not very strong. You'll also notice that the knee's usually going to cross the toe coming forward, where that's going to put him on a lot of pressure going to the balls of his feet, which then in turn is going to put a lot of pressure on that knee. Usually there's going to be some kind of a shearing laterally happening in the knee whenever he comes back and forth. Let's go back to the standing position. Let's come back over here. So as he comes here, the knee will begin to track laterally. Definitely not healthy, definitely not good for those ACLs. And that's usually oftentimes what can lead to a lot of ACL tears. Let's come back. So those are going to be the main things that we're going to be witnessing out of the front of the body. Let's take a step again. Another thing is, try pushing out your stomach. So this is also another thing that will happen. I've untrained him from doing this, but people's stomachs will usually begin to hang outward. As the lower abdomen begins to elongate, usually because of the anterior pelvic dysfunctions, in terms of anterior pelvic tilt, when you put the stomach into an elongated position, it will no longer be able to recruit the transverse abdominis for stability. So sometimes what will happen is the stomach will begin to hang outward as he comes down into that deeper side lunging position. Let's go back to standing. Looking at a lateral view of the dysfunctions on the body during a side lunge, we're going to have Mike going into it again. So we step out to the side. Again, that knee is going to be driving forward. The thoracic spine is going to be driving forward. The belly is going to be hanging out. These are going to be all the dysfunctions found. The pressure is primarily going to be on the toes while he's standing here instead of it being on the heels. So right now he's putting a lot of that pressure, and a lot of that femur is putting a significant amount of pressure right here on that patellar tendon. Let's go back. This is obviously not going to be very comfortable for him because I've kind of trained him out of this, and he'll probably feel his joints hurting a little bit. So we won't do too many repetitions like this. So you'll see that knee really driving forward, his weight really just being forward. And you'll see how strong his center of gravity will be from there if he goes in that direction. But just very, very common to see that knee coming forward. Let's go again, Mike. Always watch for that thoracic spine. Another thing to look at is lumbar curvatures. Extend out the arms that way, Mike. And again, always looking for the head coming upward and that overdevelopment of those upper trapezius muscles at the top. All right, that's the lateral view of it. Now let's take a look at the posterior view. Okay, looking at a posterior view here, again, what we've noticed out of the squat positions before is oftentimes we'll find even people that have externally rotated feet to where they're going to turn the toes outward. So to begin with, sometimes that can usually even begin that lateral buckling. And so we'll notice here is that as he steps to the side, let's go from there, Mike. You'll also notice that as he's doing that, that's what may also promote that shearing force coming to the side. The main thing we'll notice right here on the posterior view is mainly within the thoracic spine that we'll notice this curvature happening here. There may be like some jaggedness happening in the hips because his hips are maybe like swayed as he's coming forward. So there is going to be some dysfunction here. You'll see how much pressure that lumbar spine is taking there. Well, then at the same time, you'll notice how little activity is happening here in the thoracic spine to support that region of the thoracic. So again, these areas will be elongated. These areas will tend to take a lot of pressure, and you'll also notice that those knees are coming outward. And that's mainly what we'll notice out of the posterior view during a side lunge. Let's go back, Mike. Okay, now we just covered the dysfunctions. Now let's go into the functional positions during a side lunge. Analyzing the proper positioning of a side lunge, to begin with, we always want to look at getting the neutral posture firsthand. So let's make sure those feet are straight forward, Mike. So we always want to ensure that the feet are completely straight forward. We're getting joint stacking from the humerus all the way down to the ankle before we even initiate the movement itself. From there, I'm going to have Mike going into the side lunge. He's going to be going there. What we're going to be looking at from there is the stacking of the joints from the ankles, knees, hips, and shoulders. From there, the thoracic spine is going to be extended. Let's draw that navel in a little further. Let's square up the hips a little more this way. Let's draw that navel in. Okay, elbows at your side. So right there, have the palms facing each other. So right there, we'll notice a good amount of efficiency happening there. Most of the pressure is going to be on his heels. Very little pressure will be on that leg. So we have most of the pressure being applied on the outer foot because that's where he's going to generate his force to bring him back to his standing position. So as you'll see there is a very fluid movement. We'll come back. He hinges back, joints are all stacked, the navel's drawn in, thoracic spine is completely extended. You'll see that nice open chest there, which means his scapula is retracted and his thoracic is extended. We press off of this heel to bring him back to that center position. Go again. Coming back. Again, geometric angles everywhere. Go again. Everything is in alignment. We see all that stacking happening there, so that means all the joints are protected by the muscular system. Let's go back. Okay, now let's look at a lateral view of the official biomechanics of a side lunge. Analyzing the lateral view of a side lunge, we're going to mainly be noticing the relation between the shin bone and the torso, and that the angles should be about the same. So if he's here in a standing position right now, you'll notice that his torso is primarily at the same positioning as the shin bone. So this is going to be in alignment. As he steps to the side, we want to think about that being at equal angle. So as he's here, you'll notice the torso is about here. The shin bone is at a similar angle. Most of the pressure is at the hip. Let's come back. So when he's landing, what we're going to think about is that he's going into pelvic flexion coming down. So he's trying to load the gluteal structures. When he goes into pelvic flexion, dropping back, what then is happening is a stretch mechanism happening in the hamstrings. As he comes down into that squat phase or that side lunge phase, what then that's going to do is create a tension in the hamstring, which will then invariably bring you back into that posterior tilt. And eventually that's where you drive your power off of your glute. So as he steps to the side, he hinges off of that hip. Then from there, as he presses off that leg, you'll notice, let's go back up. He goes right back into that standing position and he gets that great gluteal activation there. So he comes forward. We'll also notice the position of the knee. The knee does not come over the toe from here. We're getting a great hinge. There's very little pressure coming onto the knee from there. It's really, really great positioning. We come back, drive the pelvis under from there, Mike. So we get that neutral stance. Then we come back again, hinging, navel in. We'll also notice there might be a small bit of a curvature here in the lumbar spine. Let's rotate posteriorly a slight bit, then draw the navel in. Now we'll drop this anteriorly. So now we're really loading that hamstring in place. We're going to extend the thoracic spine a little further here, retract the scapula. So now we're getting a much more neutral spine over here. We drive back. Let's go one more time. spine neutral, draw the navel in. Pelvis is going to be back from here. Good, navel in, scapula back. Then we drive off that heel. Boom, great efficiency on that. Let's move on to the posterior view. Analyzing the posterior view of a side lunge, we'll already notice that Mike's posture is already pretty good to begin with. So we're noticing that there's a good amount of thoracic activity going on. There's not too much jagged curvature happening right here in the lumbar because he's getting some transverse abdominis function. So right now everything's looking good to begin with. So we'll step out to the side from there, Mike. The main thing we'll notice is that there might be some curvatures that begin to pop up, so we'll have to draw that navel in a little further. Let's try squaring up the hips a little more this way. Then we draw that navel in further, draw the pelvis back from there, rotate the pelvis under a slight bit there, Mike. So now we're kind of trying to take some of that curvature away from there, put it onto that abdominal system. We press back off the heel, maintain that position, get back to the neutral spine, Mike. There you go. So this is a very challenging exercise. If you just do it correctly, automatically you're already having to battle a lot of dysfunctions to begin with if you're looking at trying to correct these dysfunctions. Let's step out to the side again, draw the navel in. Slightly rotate the pelvis under there, Mike. Tuck the hip under, slightly a little more, tuck this under. There you go, hold that position. So we're trying to get this as neutral as possible. We kind of do notice a slight bit of an overdevelopment of the right side of the erector spinae. That's gonna be okay because most of his other mechanics are doing pretty well. Let's come back. Spine's neutral. We come out and step to the side. Hinging the hips back. So there's not really gonna be too much to notice for the most part. Let's try squaring the hips up a little more. Pull the scapula back. A little further, draw the navel in. So right here we're noticing a nice straight spine. That's the main thing that we're looking at, that there's no major asymmetries going on side to side. Let's come back, and we're good. So the main thing speaking of is when you're going to the side, we don't want those asymmetries happening where you're shooting from one side to the other. That's the main thing that we're going to notice out of the posterior end of the body when you're doing this exercise. And really try focusing on keeping that spine neutral. Really try focusing on loading those hips, and you'll definitely be good to go. Now I'm going to show you guys the full version of this exercise and cover the exact applications of what I would be looking at while we're doing the exercise. All right, looking at the application once again, spine is neutral, thoracic is extended, the body is in alignment before we begin anything. So I'll have Mike stepping out to the side for the lunge. Most of the pressure's onto the outer leg. The navel's drawn in, elbows are right next to each other, so keep that in place. We press back. Go, let's do the other side. We press back, navel's in. So you'll see his posture is completely intact. You'll see that when he gets to each side, he'll really be able to generate forward. Really press hard off of there, Mike, on the next one. Really press hard. You'll see he's able to get a lot of power off of the step, and that's what's indicating to me that he's moving effectively. Spinal alignment, spinal integrity is always intact while we're doing these exercises. On this side, we notice the stop there. Again, everything is stacking up, so let's put a little more pressure on the outer leg. Everything stacks up. He drives off that heel. Boom, and he's in place. All right, let's turn and face that direction, Mike. Given that side view, main things we're going to look for here. Again, that knee is not dragging over the ankle. We step to the side, hinges the hip back, drives off that right glute, and brings himself back. Good. Drive the navel in. Forward. Good. Keep that navel drawn in. Good. Dropping the chest a little too much on that side. Good. So we notice that he was kind of going into a slight hip flexion. Hold that position, Mike. Hold that, rotate the pelvis under, tuck your left glute under a little more. Now we have to just square the hips up more this way. There you go. So again, there are going to be some biomechanical deficiencies that we have to focus on. Try squaring the hips a little more this way, Mike. There you go. Now we drive off that heel. The key point is that we're trying to maintain that pelvis completely neutral in that position. Again, I'm looking for biomechanical perfection. Most people would accept that as being okay. Under my context of what I deem acceptable, that's definitely not. But at this point, still a work in progress. It's still a basic movement. Side lunge is a very challenging exercise whenever you're trying to do it correctly. So again, be looking towards doing it when you're stepping to the side. There's no shifts happening to one direction or the other, that we're sticking to that frontal plane. All right, let's move on to the next exercise. The next exercise that we're going to be covering will be a one-arm row. The primary function of this is to really target the latissimus dorsi as well as the posterior chain of the scapula. After we go into that one arm row, we're going to start to learn to integrate rotation into it to activate the posterior oblique system, which means we'll be firing one lat contralaterally with one glute. So that's when we really start focusing on the integrated movement. For right now, we're focusing on the isolation. Let's take a look at the dysfunctional movement patterns found in this exercise, and then we'll go into the functional ones. Looking at some common anterior dysfunctions, the main ones that are really going to pop out at you from the anterior view are going to be located primarily in the thoracic spine. So let's actually round the thoracic spine from there, Mike. So right off the bat, you'll notice that people will generally tend to want to lean forward, which then kind of provokes this forward burgeoning of the shoulders, or that rounding, kyphotic rounding found in that thoracic spine. So that's really going to be the main thing that we'll notice. As he begins to go into the row, try pulling back from there, Mike. I'm going to posture up a little bit more, about right there, and just kind of keep the thoracic rounded. What we'll notice is that he's probably going to tend to get an overactivity of his bicep here, coupled with an overactivity of the trapezius muscles. So this is definitely going to be what more than likely your body's going to do when you go into that row, because you haven't learned to integrate your scapular muscles quite yet. Usually, again, the stomach will usually be popping out. It's going to be probably hard for him to do that because I've untrained him out of that. But usually you'll notice somebody's belly will begin to pop out. The knees will begin to buckle forward. Even then, sometimes what you'll notice out of people too is that bring your feet wider. Anytime they approach the pulley, they'll usually come with their feet really, really wide and try and find their center from there. Definitely not a good position where he's going to be. So main things to notice: overactivity of the bicep, overactivity of the tricep, directly as a result of kyphotic rounding, the rounding of the thoracic spine, and then from there the knees buckling forward. But you won't really be able to see much of this until we go into the side view, which is what we're going to go into right now. Looking at the lateral dysfunctions found during a one-arm row, we're going to see that the knees are usually going to tend to buckle forward simply because people haven't really learned to activate their posterior chain or find their center of gravity. So usually the knees will come forward. There's going to be a weight distribution coming onto the toes, and we'll also notice kind of like this forward angle of the body because they haven't learned how to kind of center themselves while this thing's pulling them under. So we'll actually come back a little bit further. That's about accurate to what most people will do. The knees will actually usually come further forward. So that's typically what we're going to find out about a lot of it. He's not really eliciting too many bad behaviors because I've kind of trained him out of the bad behaviors. But again, just kind of notice the rounding of the thoracic spine here. Sometimes we'll also see a lumbar curvature. Let's go anterior tilt. So we'll also notice a lumbar curvature coupled with that thoracic rounding when a person's doing this exercise. So those are going to be a few of the things that we notice before we go into exertion. Once we come back is when we're really going to start to see a lot of the deficiencies. Let's posture up a little bit more from here, Mike. About right there is good. Now we're going to do the row and pull back. So typically what we're going to see, as you see him doing right now, is a great bending out of the bicep here. You'll notice that there's something going beyond 90 degrees here. Most of your efficiency when you do a movement is going to stop at about 90 degrees, and he's going way past that at this point, which right now if he's going all the way back with his elbow, coming back the way that he just did, we're noticing that his bicep is going to institute a lot of elbow flexion to pull us back into that position, and we're going to overload parts of the posterior deltoid that aren't going to be oriented with functionality. We're noticing that there's very little scapular activity happening here and that there's much isolation here. Another problem that'll usually happen is that we'll notice the angle of this cable in conjunction to the angle of his arm. Right now it's like he's almost doing a bicep curl as he's pulling backward, which is a huge problem of what happens with most people when they try doing a row. It's like the bicep just takes over everything. Again, we'll notice an overdevelopment of the upper trapezius, a lot of activity. Now if somebody does try retracting their scapula, let's try retracting the scapula from there. What will usually end up happening if they come back is that they'll come back this way, but then the upper traps will elevate as they go into that row. So usually they don't get any scapular depression, and oftentimes that can be linked to the fact that there's no thoracic activity happening here. So if there's no posture going on up here, the upper traps will usually tend to become a compensator in the movement. So again, be looking for bicep activity, overstimulation, upper trapezius activity, over bending of the elbow, the angles becoming too short within that elbow region, overstimulating the bicep. And that's mainly what you're going to notice out of most people when they're doing a row. Obviously this is a great exaggeration of it, but these are just things for you to be watchful of. Again, weight distribution going onto the toes. Again, he's going back to functionality because I trained him out of it. But again, right now, this is what the few things I want you looking at. Pressure on toes, knees coming forward, bicep flexing too much, upper trapezius. Sorry about that. Let's take a little break. Let's move on to doing the posterior view. As we're looking at the posterior view, the main thing that we're going to notice out of most people when they're in their dysfunctional posture is again this kyphotic rounding of the thoracic spine, which is then, because this is so elongated, it will inhibit how well we're going to be able to adduct the scapulas towards each other. So as he goes into the range of motion, we'll notice little to no activity happening in the middle trapezius, the lower trapezius, and even parts of the rhomboids. So there's almost no activity going on here. If we look at the lumbar spine, since it's so far out of position and it's jagged, it's not giving the thoracic spine a base to directly work off of. So right now, everything that's happening here is going to be pretty much the posterior end of the rotator cuff. The biceps are going to be doing a whole lot of the work. A lot of bad stuff going on here right now from what we see on that posterior chain. So the main things that we'll notice, again, rounding of the thoracic, jagged curvatures of the lumbar, and then from there, the upper trapezius muscles taking a big brunt of the load. So you'll also notice those upper traps beginning to kind of shrug upward a slight bit. All right, those are the deficiencies found during a row. Now let's go into the efficient patterns that we're going to be looking for when we're doing this exercise. Right off the bat, we want to be looking towards that standing position. The feet, knees, hips, and shoulders are all directly stacked on top of one another. What I want Mike to do from here is probably have him lean back a little bit further, bringing his weight back, opening up his posture completely. What then we're going to want to do from here is almost slightly protract the shoulder. So let's retraction, let's go protraction. So we're going to protract the shoulder, so that way at that point we're setting the scapula up to want to retract. From there he's going to be pulling back, the elbow is going to bend, then we're going to continue to retract the scapula. So you'll notice that at that point, let's try not to rotate too far, about right there, we'll retract a little further. We'll notice a nice opening of that chest happening there. So you'll see that this is a nice and open right here in that pec region, which is indicating to us that the scapula is really activating well. Let's come forward again. The navel's completely drawn in. There's no activity of the stomach burgeoning outward, which means that we're getting good core function, which is building the dynamics to good thoracic activity, because it is the foundation to that thoracic spine. We'll also notice up here, very little upper trapezius engagement as he's going into that row. The bicep isn't becoming too active. A lot of great things going on here right now. Let's move on into the lateral view. Right off the bat, what we want to analyze on the lateral view is his positioning of his torso. We want this to be a completely vertical line. Like I mentioned before, people will generally, even when they try doing this correctly, they'll lean forward, extend your thoracic spine from there, pull out, extend it. So going back the other way. They'll usually extend their thoracic spine from here, thinking they're in a good posture. What I need you guys to think about is that you're going to slightly lean back from here. It may feel like you're going to fall back, coming back this way, but you'll actually be able to find your center pretty easily, as long as you can have the confidence that you'll be able to find your balance. We want to have a slight bend in the knee right here. We want to keep the pressure primarily onto the heels. Again, that nice vertical column happening here. What that's going to enable us to do when we have this vertical column is to create a 90-degree angle from the elbow all the way down to the torso. So as he goes into the row, pulling the scapula back, we'll stop at the torso. We'll see a nice 90-degree angle that should develop. Let's pull back a little further. Right there. So now we complete the 90-degree angle happening in the arm here. So now everything is nice and vertical. We see the alignments happening everywhere. Let's come forward again. Excellent. Now we come back. Excellent. Now what we want to see, let's go forward with the arm, is that as he's bringing the arm forward, he's loading the muscles on the back end. So as he comes forward, let's go to the forward phase of this. This is all loaded here. The spine's remaining neutral. There's no activity happening in terms of activity here in the upper shoulder. So the spine is completely neutral. All the activity is about to begin here. This is all completely neutral. What he's then going to do is initiate movement with the scapula with the straight arm. So that's where the initiation phase happens. Let's come forward again. After he gets that initiation, let's initiate from the scapula, he's going to bend the elbow and then continue to retract the scapula at the same time. What then that's going to do is recruit a major contraction out of that latissimus dorsi, that major back muscle that's right here. Let's come forward. So we start with the straight arm, we retract, we bend the arm, continue with the retraction, and then we come forward. When people attempt this exercise right here, one of the biggest mistakes that they'll make, let's lean back a little further, extend your thoracic spine, let's get that neutral position, so we're getting good position here. So what they'll normally do is start with the straight arm, pull the scapula back, and then I want you to just bend the elbow by itself without the scapula. they'll do is they'll actually row, and you'll notice that this jagged positioning of the humerus coming here, really, really bad on that biceps tendon. We do not want that to happen. We need this to retract back. Let's pull that scapula back and take it out of that position. So we want this stuff opening up right here. We don't want that jagged shooting of the humerus coming forward, because that's really bad on the biceps tendon. Let's bring the elbow back a little further. So we pull that all the way back to alignment, then we retract the scapula. Should really begin to feel those suckers spiraling right now. Again, all these alignments happening here. The elbow does not go behind the torso. Let's pull the elbow behind the torso from there, Mike. So let's actually do it dysfunctionally. So we're going. A big problem that oftentimes people will have too is that when they do a row, they'll come all the way back in this direction. I see this out of every person I've ever seen do a row. Not good at all. And then also there's going to be a kink happening in the wrist here, as Mike was just doing. That is usually accompanied by that. So there's flexion in the wrist, flexion in the bicep, and that's taking all the pressure off of the lat, placing it onto the upper trapezius, the biceps, and the forearm muscles, which is not going to be very effective. So we come forward with the arm. Proper way of doing it, we retract the scapula, continue to retract as the elbow goes into flexion. We stop at the torso and don't go any further from there. Let's move on to the posterior view. Analyzing the posterior view of doing the back row, what we're going to be looking at primarily is the activity happening right here in the scapula and the little activity that's going to happen in the upper trapezius. The main thing you'll notice on the back end for somebody when they're doing a dysfunctional row is this overstimulation of the muscles up here. What we want to be focusing on more than anything else is getting the lower traps and the thoracic spine most of the activity. So as Mike begins to go into the row here, we're doing the proper one. Pull the scapula back. We really want the sucker to be into that proper retraction. So we'll notice that a good activity is happening right here out of that T-spine. We come forward again. So we'll see the initiation happens here in the scapula. We'll see all that movement that begins to happen there. Whereas before, when you were looking at the dysfunctional elements of it, there was no activity going on here. Now, I will not say that this is a perfect row at this given point, because this is something we're still working on, but you still can see a significant amount of activity happening at the lower ends. The upper traps are nice and soft. There's not really a lot of activity happening, and that's indicating to me that we are doing this exercise correctly. If we notice the lumbar spine right here is nice and soft. There's no major jagged curvatures happening there, which is also indicating to me that we're giving the thoracic spine a significant amount of support while we're in this position. So again, the main thing that we'll notice right here in the posterior view, upper trapezius overstimulation if it's dysfunctional, lower trapezius activation if it is in function when we're doing the range of motion. All right, now let's move on to the full application of this exercise. All right, so the application of this exercise, we're looking at the feet, knees, hips, and shoulders, all being completely in alignment. If we take a look at the side view over here, it's completely vertical. The torso is completely vertical from here. This is going to require Mike to lean back a little bit further in order to achieve that. The body is leaning forward from here. We're not going to do that, and then we're shortening that angle, and we're not going to get those 90 degrees we're looking for effective lat contraction. So from there we go into the row. You'll notice an initiation happening in his scapula, the elbow bending, and the continuation of the retraction of the scapula, beginning to pull the arm all the way back. So we come forward with the arm, initiation from the scapula, bends the elbow, continuation of the scapula. We stop at 90, pretty much to where the elbow is neutral to the middle of his pelvis. We come forward and back, neutral spine. So at that point, we're getting good activity in the core to support the thoracic spine above. Excellent job. Let's bend the knees a little bit more there, Mike. There you go. Then we lean back. We come back from there. Great form. Also notice a nice opening happening over here. Not a jagged shearing force happening right here at that biceps tendon, so everything is nice and open. We come forward. Let's move on to that posterior view. So as we're coming to the back end, we'll see that when it retracts, you'll see that scapula coming back. Everything is extended. It looks phenomenal here. We come forward again. So we're getting that great activity happening out of that scapular region. This is a great posture builder. This is going to be an awesome exercise to really start building those postural dynamics when we're introducing these types of movements effectively. This is huge for developing the lats, and eventually what we're going to focus on in the next exercise is the activation of this left lat accompanied with the contralateral engagement of that right glute. So once we pull that left lat, we're going to notice that there's going to be a natural rotation or a natural activation that happens from here, from the lat to the thoracolumbar fascia, then eventually into the glute. But this right here is great. This is a great preparatory exercise to start building those postural dynamics, so you start learning how to operate within your glenohumeral region and how to stabilize from your scapula when you're going into that thoracic activity and scapular activity. All right, let's move on into the next exercise. For the next exercise that we're going to cover, it's really just going to be a continuation of the one-arm row. We're only this time we're going to add a rotation. The purpose of adding the rotation is so we start learning to integrate the upper and lower body specifically within the posterior oblique system. So if I have Mike doing like a one-arm row from his right side here, like if we're replicating the same dynamics, what we're also usually going to find is a slight bit of rotation that happens in the T-spine here, and then from there, as he pulls back, we'll see an activation that will happen with the left glute as he's coming back. Now, these types of movements are replicated in almost all transverse plane movement, be it a baseball swing, a knockout punch, or your running stride. This is probably one of the most common movement patterns that you'll find in nature altogether for human beings. So this is going to be one of the most crucial movements that we can master in terms of functional application into reality, specifically into dynamic environments. So let's go into the deficiencies found during this exercise, and then after that we'll go into the more functional applications of this exercise. Looking at the deficiencies during a rotational movement, again, the shoulders are usually going to be completely out of line with everything. Rather than initiating force with the lower body first, what you'll find generally with the person is that they're going to tend to try and integrate with their upper body. So I want you doing the row and then trying to do the rotation from there, Mike. So you're just going to go here, and then you're going to try and initiate the rotation with your upper body. It's very weird for me to teach them this because I've kind of untrained them out of it. Let's lean back a little bit further, about right there. So what you'll find is that the bicep does all the movement, and there's not much, there's rotation happening in the hip, but the kinetic energy is not building from the lower body. Once we start thinking about integrating the body, we have to think about kinetic linking starting from the ground up. If we start linking our body from doing everything from the arm up, from the arm down, we're going to start missing some major links in the movement, and we're not going to have any efficiency that comes from those movements. So right now we're just noticing that his biceps doing all the work, and his lower body isn't really helping us at all when we're doing this. We're noticing a lot of upper trapezius activity, a lot of bicep activity, how I had mentioned before. Let's go into the lateral view. Like I had mentioned before, what will generally tend to happen is that people will tend to want to lean forward, which then is further going to inhibit how well a person's thoracic spine is going to be functioning when they're coming here. What we want to be looking at is not only thoracic extension, but also thoracic rotation as he's coming back. He's going to get neither of them right there relative to the position that his upper body is in. So as he's leaning forward, he is not going to get very much activity out of that specific region. So we want to be very watchful of that. Again, most of the time people's knees will begin to come forward significantly, and we won't really get too much activity happening out of the torso because now the quads become too dominant, the calves become too dominant. We'll also notice pressure going onto the toes. Not very good stuff going on here. Also, what can become a danger, let's go anterior tilt in the pelvis. If we look at the lumbar spine right here, we'll notice these jagged curvatures happening in the lumbar, which is not going to be favorable. If we're not getting rotation in the thoracic spine, we're going to start getting rotation into the lumbar. Not good. These areas are not meant to be that way. They didn't adapt to get rotation in that region, and we need to place it up here. So when he's in this position with the kyphotic posture and a lordotic posture right here in the lower back, all that pressure is going to the erector spinae along with the upper trapezius and the other portions of the body. Looking at everything from a posterior view, we'll see again the lower back taking most of the load. We'll see the erector spinae right here on the right side doing most of the pressure. We'll notice the upper trapezius muscles overly engaging. Lots of bad stuff going on here, and I'm quite certain that your body will likely tend to want to do this when it's in a completely dysfunctional position. So we just covered the dysfunctions found within the body in terms of all of this. Now we're going to go into the efficient postures that we'll need to have while doing this dynamic movement. To begin, we're looking at the same posture we were looking at before. Most of the pressure is going to be on the heels. The posture is nice and open. Everything is upright into the upper body. Again, let's go back into that row. So right now we're going to notice that he's going to be driving more pressure off of his right glute. So let's initiate force with the right glute. The glute is what's then going to stimulate the body to want to start going into a slight rotation. The lats then after that are going to give us a response as a result of the bases underneath giving us that assistance. So the glutes initiate force, and then you'll notice that right here, the pecs will usually begin to open up. You'll notice that nice open position right there in the pecs. Really, really good dynamics happening here. If we give ourselves a side view from here, let's get onto the heel. If we give ourselves a side view, right now he's a completely upright column, and that's enabling us to rotate out of the thoracic spine, which I'll show you guys in a posterior view in a second. But right here, still in the lateral view, we're noticing that initiation of this right glute, that neutral spine, and then from there, that activity happening in the scapula, which means that we're getting that crisscross pattern within those lats and those gluteal regions on the opposite end. Good. Now, if we notice what we can start doing, since he's starting to generate so much force with his lower body, let's stand a little bit lower. I want you to lean back a little bit more from there, Mike. Now I want you to try and make this more ballistic. I want you to really drive your hip forward, and then from there, allow yourself to bring that scapula back. So now that he's centered, he's going to be able to develop centrifugal force within his movement because he has that. Let's lean forward a little bit. And stay leaning forward. So if he pulls from there, try pulling hard from there, he will not really be able to get as much leverage as if he leans back. So let's lean back and make the body an upright column. Spine stays neutral. If he's there, you'll notice the efficiency that automatically comes from there because he's found his center of gravity. Let's slow down from here. Okay, stop there. Another thing we have to think about is that since this is pulling his body forward, immediately he has to adjust his center of gravity backward to compensate. So let's adjust the center of gravity. So when he does this movement, we want to ensure that he leans back a slight bit because that's going to inhibit his center. If we want a center of gravity to be intact to where we get rotation, we need to be completely upright so we can rotate. So if we're still leaning forward, we're not operating within a center of gravity. When we lean back slightly, we adjust it because this is pulling our center forward, and then from there, that's when we can get that torque. Let's go with a few more repetitions. We'll go about mid-speed. Let's move on to the posterior end of the body. Right now, we're getting a little bit of a jagged curvature, Mike. Let's correct that. Let's bring the hips back slightly. Rotate the pelvis under. Scapula back. Okay, good. Now what we're going to focus on right here is drawing in that navel. I want him to tucking that right glute under, and then from there, pulling with the left lat. Excellent. We come forward, and then we come back. Excellent. Let's move those hips behind you a little bit more, Mike. Good. So we're noticing a good amount of thoracic activity happening right here in the upper back. So we want this region right here getting a significant amount of rotation. Really try driving off of the right glute from here, Mike. Good. So now he's getting a lot of power happening here. Let's retract that scapula a little further. Extend that thoracic spine a little more. Beautiful job here. See, this is looking really good here. Let's rip a few hard ones. Go. Good. So you see right now he's able to get all that activity happening in the T-spine because his lower structures are in place. Let's make sure those pelvic muscles are in place. Let's switch to the other side. We'll step over to your left from there. Good. So we want to give ourselves a nice open space across the cable from here. So we're giving ourselves an open space so he steps across so that way the cable can come straight across. We move the pelvis back this way. Scapula back. Let's come back with that elbow. Let's move back to a lateral view coming this way. Another thing I want you guys to notice is that as he's coming forward, we hold that position at the end. Hold that. So as he holds that position, he's loaded. He's got his thoracic spine toward, his obliques are loaded as well. So from there, now since he's got this rotation built, what that's going to enable him to do is drive and pull that left arm, that right arm back. So now he comes with that forward motion, he's loaded, then he pulls back, and that's what will enable him to make it much more ballistic. Go about 5 hard ones. So that's what's enabling us to kind of train that sling system that happens out of that anterior and posterior oblique system. Pull again. If we notice on the opposite side of his body, we'll see a reciprocity movement happening here. He shoots this arm straight forward. He does not shoot it across this way. Oftentimes what people might do is reach across. We reach at a parallel angle to the pulley. So the arm is at a parallel angle. Pull the scapula back a little more. Spine stays neutral. So it's at a completely parallel angle as we're going here. He comes forward with the right arm. He comes back. Extend the thoracic, lean back a little further, draw the navel in. So now we're noticing how the upper body is integrating. We have a push coming on the left side and a pull coming on the right side. Really good mechanics here. He's initiating pressure from his left glute before anything else. Great mechanics going on here. Great stuff going on here. All right, let's move on to the next exercise. For this exercise, we're going to start to set the foundations up to maybe the most important plane of motion that you can use with your entire body. We have the sagittal plane moving straight forward and back. We have the frontal plane moving laterally. Now we're going to start instituting rotation. Rotation is found in our movement pattern more than any other time of the day, specifically like when you're doing walks, when you're throwing something, when you go to reach and pick something up. There's always going to be some type of rotation instituted by your body. So this is going to be the most important plane of motion to master if you expect to want to really develop functional mechanics. With that said, it's also the most difficult, and there's going to be many things we have to look for when it comes to doing it, because although it is the most rewarding, it can also be one of the most dangerous if there's not proper intrinsic core stability happening within the body. It's one of the most avoided planes because of this, because it's generally more challenging to do than all the other planes of motion, just simply due to the complexity and the 3 dimensions involved with it. Now, I could go into talking about the deficiencies found on how people try applying a transverse twist. I've seen many fitness professionals, but at this point, I just noticed that most of them are completely off the mark when it comes to applying it. So from my end, I could probably spend about 40 minutes to an hour just explaining all the things that people do wrong in terms of teaching rotation right now. Although I'd love to, I don't really have time for this on this video. So what I want to do right now is kind of just show you what happens when I try and institute rotational dynamics into a body. When I try getting them to do it functionally. Now, right now, we're not going to do a full-on rotation. We're going to do more of an introductory version of rotation and try and just get the mechanisms of the rotational plane down, of getting the movement pattern down, of getting rotation down, so that way we know where we're supposed to be going with our biomechanics. If we do not do this right now, it's likely that when you start going into the full range of the motion with the rotation, you might begin to go into certain compensations with your lumbar vertebrae, with your upper body, with your knees, and we don't want those types of things. So this is purely right now to get your stance down, understand how you're supposed to integrate your body. After we learn to integrate the body is when we'll move on to into full-on ranges of motion, and then we'll start really getting into the fun stuff of doing multiplane ballistic movements. For right now, let's move into the deficiencies. After that, we'll go into the efficiencies of movement. At this stage of looking at the transverse plane, I'm not going to have you guys going through the full range of motion. I'd rather turn this into more of a static exercise, because it can be significantly damaging if you don't do the basic positionings down first. Looking at a proper transverse plane at movement, as we're going into rotation, let's do it, Mike. There's going to be a lot of efficiencies that have to be in place when we're doing it. Let's come back. And what my whole goal is going to be is to help you guys understand what the end range of motion is going to be. So we go all the way over, hold that position. So we want to look at the end of the range of motion before anything else. Your body, it's like, let's say for instance, like I'm trying to give you guys a map of where to go. This is a map of where you need to go in terms of your biomechanical structure when you execute the transverse plane. We have to understand what that is first. Before your brain can say, okay, this is how we're going to rotate, it needs to know, okay, this is the place that we need to be at in order to get efficiency out of our movement. So that's my whole goal with this specific exercise that we're going to cover. Right now, what I'm going to show you guys are the deficiencies found when a person begins to go into this ending of the range of motion. The biggest problems that I find, so that way you'll know what to look for when you hopefully begin to videotape yourself and you start looking at your own biomechanical structure. These are the biggest deficiencies I find, and this will be extremely useful in you finding out what's wrong with your own body, because it's highly likely you're going to do this. I think in my entire career of teaching people how to do proper transverse plane dynamics, I don't think I've ever seen anybody do it correctly. And I've dealt with high-level professional athletes, and even then they have it off. So let's go into that right now. Mike, let's grab that pulley. I'm going to have Mike stepping forward in this direction. So right now I have this little box diagram set up. I want you to bring your right leg back, Mike, and then we'll bring the left leg forward. So right now we're working on building the dynamics of the end of the range of motion to the transverse plane. And right now with Mike, he's going to be bringing his left foot on one end of the box. So let's say if we have a little box here, he's going to bring his left foot on this end of the box, and then this right foot is going to be on this other end of the box. So that's where we want to start in terms of getting the range of motion. But even when I get somebody into this position, I'm still going to end up finding a lot of deficiencies with the body. Namely being, to begin with, let's move into the lateral plane. We're into the lateral vision. We're going to find right off the bat that the knees begin to come outward. So let's extend the arms, Mike. Let's finish out the range of motion. Let's bring the back heel off the ground. So to begin with, the knee will begin to fall forward, and we'll also notice this forward falling of the upper body along with that. So people start to move in the sagittal plane. The main reason this happens is because people in general tend to train in the sagittal plane when they exercise. Also, they begin to shut a lot of biomechanical efficiencies in their body when they sit down for an extended period of time. So since their body becomes shut down in terms of transverse plane functions, it's going to want to compensate with sagittal plane movement. And the main places that are going to shift sagittally is going to be the knees, and then the upper body is going to tend to follow right after that. So that's going to be a huge thing. Beyond all that, what we're also going to notice is a lordotic curvature right here out of the lumbar spine, and then a thoracic curvature, a kyphotic curvature as he's coming up. Let's reach out with the arms. And then from there, an upper trapezius engagement is going to ensue thereafter. Let's bring the head up. Cervical extension will then pop up. Let's extend that cervical. We'll end up having a posture that looks like this. Some people will also do this. Plant your back heel on the ground. They'll actually just plant down because they've never actually learned how to distribute weight to the opposite side. As you can see right now, he's having problems just trying to keep his hands at about a neutral level because his shoulders are just getting such a beating right now. You'll see right now his stomach's going to tend to want to pop out. Everything kind of just looks completely out of place. Definitely not a good stance to be in. It's likely that you're going to have a lot of these mechanics. So a quick synopsis of what we're going to look at. Extend out the arms. Shrugging of the traps, a kyphotic rounding of the thoracic spine, a lordotic curvature of the lumbar spine. We'll look at the knees coming forward, a lot of pressure going to the front toe. And then from there, sometimes you might notice a flat foot happening on the back side of the body. So these are going to be the main things that you'll look for when you try getting into that static hold for that transverse abdominis. So those are the deficiencies that I want you guys primarily looking at from the lateral plane. Let's flip around to the anterior plane over here. As we see this right here, you'll notice that his body begins to kink over all the way over to one side. Now, if this happens to a minor degree, that's okay. But right now, this is definitely excessive based upon what we're doing. Right now, he actually looks pretty good. This looks better than about 99% of people that I've seen. Now he's starting to screw it up a little more, which is good. Let's round that thoracic a little further. So now we're starting to see what most people are generally going to do. They're going to start to tense their shoulders up. Not a good sign of efficiency happening here. So right now we're just noticing all these deficiencies kind of popping up here as we look at the body from an anterior view. Let's take a look at the posterior view on this side. Once again, further rounding of the thoracic spine, further curvatures and jaggedness of that lumbar spine. A lot of curvatures happening in this direction. I mean, this is going to be a very difficult thing for him to do improperly because I trained him out of that. But again, just try looking for those patterns and you'll have a good base point to work off in terms of what not to do. I just covered what not to do with your body. Let's cover what we need to do with your body while we're doing this transverse plane hold. We just covered the deficiencies found during the transverse plane. Before we get into covering some efficiencies of the transverse plane, I want to just kind of break down a little bit of geometry on how I kind of came to the conclusions of where I'm coming from. Pretty much, this is that we look at right here. This is called a trapezoid triangle. I had somebody who knew physics who kind of drew it down. We wound up discovering that it was a trapezoid, and then from there I started finding that there was boxes all over the place, and I started analyzing the mechanics of the body. And I started seeing that most transverse plane movement, when it's efficient, is going to operate within this box of movement. And so when I'm operating within this box, what I want you guys to think about is that there's always going to be triangles within it. So if I make an X on this box, what we're going to tend to find is a bunch of triangles here. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Pythagorean's theorem or not, but pretty much what it says is that you can measure most things via a triangle. So if you see here, we make an X on this triangle, we're going to see a bunch of X on this box, we'll see a bunch of triangles begin to pop up everywhere. What I want you guys to think about when you're involving yourself in rotation is that your center of gravity is at the crossing point of this X right here. So this is your center of gravity. Your body should not leave the center of gravity whenever you're doing rotation. So as you're going in through the movement and going from one side to the other, the rotation needs to be there. So as you're holding the isometric at the end, we have to think about keeping our body into the center of gravity. The balls of the feet are going to be going right here. So we're going to go balls of the feet right there on each end of the box. So right there we make a box. If I go to the other side, that's where the box works. Now the square is going to be relative to your hip width. Based upon how wide your hips are, it's going to determine how big this box is going to be in terms of length and how big that square is going to be. So always just use your hips to kind of measure the length of where you're going to be. But the key point is that we put the balls of the feet on each one of the ends of these. No matter how we're standing, we're staggering the stance, and then from there we also want to look at the center of gravity and our pelvis, pretty much our coccyx being right over the top of the center of gravity the entire time. Before we begin this exercise, what I want you guys to understand is that this is purely a progressive system, and that right now all I'm trying to do in this level 1 phase is put you into a situation where you're going to succeed later on down the road. If you understand the biomechanical efficiencies and where you're supposed to be in terms of the ends of the range of motion, then we're going to be successful. So that means that right now, I'm not going to put you in the same position I would put you in for level 2. It's a very basic thing. When you're in level 1, what I want you focusing on right now on doing the static hold, I want you standing with your stagger stance with your right leg back if you're going to be applying pressure this way. Once we get to level 2 is when I'll have you switch it and go into a range of motion. Since we're in a static position right now, I'm going to have you just standing here. We're just holding this position. There's going to be a resistance pulling us in this direction, and that's going to promote this activation of the anterior oblique system. This is what's going to allow us to start making the connection in the brain that we activate the external obliques, the internal obliques, and the adductors in one motion as we're going across. After we get that static system down, what we're then going to do is switch our stance. Then from there, once we get the mechanics down of that finished range of motion, we're going to grab and rotate in this direction. But for right now, we need to build those dynamics. Remember, this is a transition to function, so we can start moving on to the fun stuff later. All right, let's grab that pulley mic. So right now, I'm going to have Mike stepping forward with his left leg, and his right leg is going to be backward. If we're looking at efficiency, let's start at the lateral view over here. Right off the bat, we want to be looking at his knees being right over his ankles. So his knees are not going to begin to shear forward in this direction. They're going to stay back. So we're going to slightly sit back on this left hip. Slight pelvic flexion going on here. From there, he's going to bring his heel all the way up off the ground. We'll also notice that his feet, the balls of his feet for the most part should be on the X. For him, this is about pretty good because his pelvic structure is a little bit wider. So we're going to lift his back foot off the ground. So we'll see that right now, the spine is fairly neutral. Let's rotate that pelvis under. The thoracic is extended. Now he's going to be ready to hold onto that pulley and extend the arms out. We're drawing the navel in from there. Let's move the hips over just a little further this way, Mike. A little more to your right. About right there is good. Let's come down a little lower into your stance. So even as he comes down lower into his stance, you'll notice, let's come down lower. So even as he comes down, there will be no movement happening in that knee forward. Let's come back up, hold that position. Let's move that right hip back a little further. A little more, the right side, beautiful. Hold that position. So right now his core is going to be lighting on fire. His obliques are generally going to be getting a major beating right now. Thoracic spine is completely in place. You'll notice he has nice posture going on up here. That heel needs to come up a little bit higher here. But his pressure right now, for the most part, is going to be on this back foot. Most of the pressure is right here on this heel. That knee's going to be over there. Let's move into the sagittal plane from there. We want to analyze the pelvic structure itself. We do not want to rotate the hips when we're trying to do this exercise. What we're trying to develop is an activation of your anterior oblique system, which means that we're going to start stimulating this external oblique, the internal oblique, and the adductor coming this way. If we start getting movement in the pelvis going across like so, what that's going to promote is more activity in the lumbar spine, and we don't want that region overcompensating because it's a smaller muscle structure. We want more of the glutes and the obliques, the lats. We want the entire rest of the kinetic chain building from here. So as we rotate across and we hold this, we don't want the pelvis to move forward. Now this is maybe the most difficult aspect of movement, period, and this is one of the most challenging that you'll probably find with yourself, and Mike might actually begin to have problems with this right now too, so I may have to correct him. So for yourself, be sure that you're watchful of this. The pelvis should not be moving anteriorly as he's going into this movement. Let's bring that back heel off the ground. Okay, let's extend out the arms. So right off the bat, we'll notice that right hip slightly comes forward. We need to move that hip back further, Mike. So now the hips become square. If we can imagine a straight line coming across from here, his hips are going to be completely square with that line going across right here where that exit point is. So the navel is going to be in. From there, he's going to rotate slightly to his left, hold that position, and we're going to notice this crisscross happening in the obliques. Now, if you also notice, his joints are all pretty much stacked on this side of his body. The only thing missing from here are going to be his foot muscles. So at this point, he needs to lift this calf up. We're going to go into plantar flexion, then lift the pinky toe off the ground. What that's going to hopefully enable us to do is straighten out that knee. The problem then becomes that when he makes the adjustment down here, his pelvis is going to want to come out and do that movement there. So he has to be very conscious of his pelvis going back and holding that position. Let's bend his left knee a little more, Mike. But overall, this is really pretty clean. In terms of what you would normally find with people, it would be very difficult for them to apply this. Notice the navel's drawn in. Notice the upper body here. The upper trapezius muscles aren't too active. The chest muscles are still fairly open. His wrist muscles are completely in alignment. His elbows are in nice and tight. His scapula is active back here. Lots of great stuff going on here. Let's move on to the posterior view. Let's lift his pinky toe up a little more. We want to look for curvatures right here in the Achilles tendon as well. He just fixed that. Let's let it go to what would be dysfunctional. Oftentimes you'll find when people do this type of movement, they'll put most of the pressure on the outer parts of their foot rather than actually bringing it inward in this direction. So now you'll notice a nice straight Achilles tendon, which means that he's going to get all the gastroc muscles, all the soleus muscles firing correctly. Lower back's getting a little bit out of position here, Mike. Let's shift the pelvis backward. More. Bring the pelvis backward further. Pull the scapula back from there. Draw the navel in. Something to be watchful of here. Let's go back into a lateral position. Is that what will begin to happen for most people is that their hips will begin to shift anteriorly in this direction. Well, in order to correct this, well, all we have to do is just move the pelvis back further this direction, then go posterior tilt from there, Mike. Go more posterior. Hold that. Then pull the shoulder blades back. So if the hips begin to get too far forward, we're going to notice jagged curvatures here. Take a break, Mike. This was brutal. That was for somebody to hold that for as long as he did. It takes a great amount of concentration. That is not an easy exercise to do. So if you see yourself starting to get it or feel yourself starting to get into those compensations, be sure to stop immediately, because now all we're promoting is the further rounding, the further curvatures of the lumbar spine. We don't want any of those dynamics. So what we want to focus on instead is trying to correct it. So if you feel like you're getting fatigue after 5 to 10 seconds and that your structure is going to start failing, stop there immediately. All we're trying to do is build a path of efficient, effective movement, and then from there, that's when we can begin to focus on building longer holds while we're doing it. But for right now, it's going to be very difficult for you to hold that initially. So there is the entire level 1 platform that we're going to be doing for this entire system. I want you guys to be practicing this for at least 2 to 3 weeks and have it mastered. The best thing that you can do if you don't have a friend to spot you or to tell you what to look for is actually put yourself on video. If you put yourself on video and start analyzing your own biomechanics and then comparing them to that of Mike or myself whenever I start doing my movement, that can be the best way of understanding whether you're doing the movements correctly or not. Sometimes what can begin to happen is that your body may not have proper intrinsic posture down completely, so it might be almost an impossibility for you to get into a functional squat position or a functional rotation position, and that's where all the structural elements of movement will come in place to ensure that you are able to get these movements down effectively. So be sure to check out my book. Be sure to check out my other videos that cover these exact postures. Otherwise, this may not be the ultimate system for you. This may do more damage than good. But this is the basic stuff. Be sure that you practice this on a regular basis, 5-6 days a week. Keep practicing it until you get the movements down, and then at that point, we can begin to focus on upping you in the later levels of this video. For this video, what I'm going to be covering is what the application of one of these circuits will look like if you are going to do this and practice this on your own. My whole thing is that I want to get you guys regimented on a specific structured program, so that way you can be successful later on. The way I have everything set up is for the sole purpose of you getting better core activation through each movement, because if we lose that intrinsic core stability, we're not going to be successful as we go along. So what we're going to do is just set the sequences up to make sure that you're operating effectively through this entire circuit. Now, this one may not be the most demanding exercise routine that you can do, but again, right now we're just thinking about building the foundations. We're thinking about building a lifelong pattern to being able to take care of your body and stay healthy for the rest of your life, so that way you can keep your vitality for a sustained period of time. So I'm not concerned about this being like just a straight 90-day program. This is an entire lifestyle change. So part of that lifestyle change is that we have to institute some foundational movement patterns to ensure that you don't end up hurting yourself later on down the road. So let's make sure that we follow this program correctly. I want you guys doing this for the next 2-3 weeks, or until you're comfortable with all these basic movements, and then after that you can start moving on to a little more of the fun stuff. For the first exercise, we're going to just be hitting a standing neutral position. Mike, let's go into a dysfunctional posture. Okay, so let's get a lateral view from here. Looking at a lateral view from here, again, we're noticing those kyphotic postures. I'm going to have Mike pretty much bring his back flush against the stick, so that way we can correct everything. So he's pulling his scapula back, he's drawing his navel in, thoracic spine is completely extended from here. You notice that there's a nice straight line out of his entire body as he's standing in this position. Let's make this a little more flat here, Mike, and extend your thoracic. So he's holding this in. We want to try and focus on getting gluteal activation, abdominal function, along with thoracic spine activation. Sometimes you might feel one area working more so than the other. But right now we're warming the body up. We're beginning to give it the foundation of all its movement, so that way when it moves on to the next exercises, it's going to be much stronger. So we're going to hold this until you feel like a significant amount of fatigue. If you're a beginner and you're not feeling fatigue after about 15 to 20 seconds, it's likely you may not be executing and you may have to reevaluate your biomechanics. Sometimes bringing that stick on the swell of your back might be one of the best ways of understanding whether you're in function or not. Really try keeping that navel in. That'll be a big part. Another thing that'll actually help significantly is rib expansion. So if I tell Mike to open his ribs up, maybe take a deep breath, that'll help significantly. Oftentimes breathing can be a problem, so if you breathe through your chest, breathe through your lungs, that will help significantly more. All right, let's move on into a plank. Let's get a lateral view coming on this side. So moving on into a plank, we're just looking for the same biomechanical things for the most part as what we would be normally getting out of a standing neutral position. We're looking at thoracic extension, neutral spine dynamics happening here. Cervical spine can be a little more retracted, but he's doing pretty good there. But that's good. He retracted his scapula fairly well. The neutral spine is going to be initiated from the transverse abdominis. Let's go a little bit higher and flatten that up. So the pelvis has to come up. We can't let the pelvis begin to sag down to the floor. Otherwise, we're going to have problems within that core system. So we need to bring the hips up a little higher. Good. Rotate the pelvis posteriorly. Extend that thoracic spine a little more, Mike. So don't think that you have to do a plank for about 2-3 minutes. I hear about people talking about doing planks for a really, really long time. You don't really need to do that. The main thing you need to think about is maybe if you put a stick on the swell of your back, thinking about how long you can hold that stick without going into deficiency. As we see right here, there's some fatigue starting to set in. He's trying to battle it, but I can tell this is going to be a losing battle here fairly soon. So rather than him training deficient biomechanics, I'd rather him train efficient biomechanics and give him a break now. So this is about the time when we'll move on to the next exercise, which will be a squat. Okay, let's go into that squat position about right there. Spine is going to stay neutral. He's already in a standing neutral position. Feet are about hip width apart. Everything's looking great to begin with right now. We're going to come down into flexion of the hips as he comes downward. Let's hold that position from there, Mike. We got to extend that thoracic, draw the navel in a little further. So right now we're getting a little too much curvature out of that lumbar. We got to extend the thoracic spine from there, bring the chest up, draw the navel in. So we have a slight curvature here. That's okay as long as it's not too extensive. So he's doing pretty good there. Let's finish out that squat. We're going to come up, rotate the pelvis under, extend the thoracic spine at the top a little more. Open up those ribs. Excellent. We come down for the squat. Navel in a little more. Beautiful mechanics there. Coming up. So the torso is in fairly good alignment with the lower body as he's here. So right there, you'll notice the torso is in pretty good alignment with that. Lean back a little further, Mike, with the upper body. Right there, we're coming down for the squat. Go. Navel in, hold that position. We come up, elbows are all the way back. We track that scapula. There you go. Pull the elbows back a little further with your scapula. Good. Hold that position there, coming down. Nice open posture happening here at the top. Draw the navel in all the way. Come on, pull that in. Let's go slight posterior tilt at the pelvis. Hold that, now draw the navel in. Hold that position, coming down, and then coming up. Hold that, coming down again. Keeping most of the pressure onto the heels as he's coming down here. The knees don't come too far forward. Hold that position, draw the navel in. We come up. Rotate the pelvis under. Excellent. We come down for that squat once again. Hold that position. We really want to try instituting some activation happening in the hamstrings. Resist me here a bit. Hold that position. So right there, he's getting into a little bit better position than what he was getting before. The knees aren't dragging forward. Right now, hopefully the hamstring should be functioning significantly. Let's straighten out the legs. Another thing to watch out for is that as he comes up, let's come down for that squat, that the knees begin to move backwards as he comes up. So let's straighten out the legs, straighten the knees. Hold that. See the knee, you tucked under a little too soon. I want the knees to come backward instead. So we initiate posterior tilt towards the end. So we come down for the squat. Start straightening the legs without posterior tilt. Let this move backwards, and then we come up, then rotate the pelvis under. Beautiful. We come down again. Straighten the legs backward. Now we tuck the hips under. So right now he's kind of sequencing the quadriceps into it. So we want the explosion to happen within that lumbopelvic region at the same time. So as he finishes out, extending the knee, that's when he finishes out the posterior tilt. Let's come down again. Then we come up. Bingo, that looks really good there. Let's make sure that this is completely neutral. And good, now let's move on into a step forward lunge. We'll just do it from right. Let's actually get on the lines over here, Mike. From there, I'm having Mike stand on the lines here. This is going to be his alignment for where he needs to be. For him, it may be a little bit further apart based upon his hip width. Let's come forward with a step. Knees not crossing the ankle as he's coming forward. We bring the back heel off the ground nice and high. Then from there, we press back and come back to the standing position. Neutral standing, beautiful. We step forward with the right leg. Hinge the hip back on the left side, on the right side, and then from there, we drive off of that heel. Go again to the left side, draw the navel in. Thoracic is extended. Coming back, neutral spine here. Coming back. Excellent job. Great job on that T-spine. Good. Not too long of a step. Hold that. Right there, coming back. So we don't want to elongate that step too far, otherwise it will affect his lateral movement. Go again. Draw that navel in. Try not to rotate the thoracic. Come back. Excellent job. Keeping everything nice and square. Beautiful job. Keep going. Again, the whole purpose right now is not to institute fatigue. If you're able to activate your intrinsic core musculature to its full effect, this will probably tire you out significantly. Really try focusing on those neutral spine dynamics. I assure you, if you focus on that to your highest effort, you will feel some fatigue begins to institute. Keep the base a little bit wider as you step forward, Mike. Right there, stop there, and then come back. Beautiful. Coming down. Excellent. All right, now we're going to move on into a side lunge. So let's face the camera from there. So now he's going to be stepping into a side lunge. I want you alternating from side to side too. So we step out to one side, hinging the hip, keep the thoracic extended. We press off that left leg, go back to the other side. Excellent. Keep the chest up, navel in. Beautiful job. See the great stacking out of the joints there? Navel's drawn in, thoracic is extended. Really driving off that heel, building that power off of each one of those steps. Really press hard off that heel, Mike. Beautiful. Now he's really getting those glutes, quadriceps, and hamstrings completely functioning. Getting neutral spine dynamics. We're starting to lose that core a little bit, Mike. Keep that spine neutral. Excellent. Keep that in place. Excellent job. Let's go 2 more times. Good. And the most important view for the specific exercise really is going to be the sagittal plane view. Again, go till you feel a small amount of fatigue setting in your intrinsic core stabilization musculature. After that's when you take a break. Usually between about 15 to 16 repetitions and when you will begin to feel fatigue on the squats, on the lunges, and on those side lunges. So that's a general rough idea of what you can think of for your specific fatigue. Now we're going to move on to a medicine ball slam. And let's give them primarily a side view from here, Mike. So I'll have you facing me. Okay, the navel's drawn in, thoracic is extended, everything is neutral. Okay, now we reach up. We slam, he's hinging his hips back as he comes downward, reach it up, hinging the hips back, beautiful. You'll also notice that he waits for momentum to bring it all the way back down. He's doing a fantastic job with that. He hinges his hips back, drives down. This is a great exercise for releasing aggression. If you do feel like you've had a rough day at work, this is the one where you can grab that ball and just slam the living heck out of it. Excellent job. Notice how he comes back to his heels as he comes down. Really getting great activation of those hamstrings. Really getting awesome activation of that core musculature. Since he's reaching up so high, he's also stretching out his lats dynamically. Really awesome job going on here. We'll go another 2. Last one coming up. And break. So hopefully you guys have your resistance bands already set up. We already have our pulley system set up over here. I'm going to up the weight for him quite a bit. All right, let's go into that 1-arm row. So his feet are going to be right side by side. Let's go with the left arm there, Mike. So we want to open up a path for that pulley to come all the way across from here. From there, we begin to involve that rotation. There's no rotation of the thoracic. We're just trying to isolate the scapula and the lats at this point. So notice that posture is opening up right here. The scapula's coming back, the elbow's bending, everything's coming back. Looking fantastic here with the mechanics. And lift his body to completely upright column. Doing an amazing job, man. Keep it up. Pull that scapula back a little further. Wow, it's looking really good. Also notice neutral alignment, his forearm directly with the pulley. This is really looking great here. Good. Keep going. Initiation with the scapula. As his bicep follows, there's a continuation with the scapula. So initiation out of the scapula, then continuation happening thereafter. All right, so we step on the other two lines from there, Mike, and then we switch sides. If you have resistance bands at home, just be sure that you step back significantly so that way you can get a good amount of resistance on those bands. He's pulling back with that scapula. Excellent job. Excellent. Let's move on to a posterior view. Oh, that looks amazing, man. Great job. This is really good here. As you see that there's no jagged curvatures happening out of the lumbar. Look at his thoracic spine, lower trap activation. Look at his lats right here. Look at his scapula. Everything's getting really good activation. Upper traps aren't really getting too much movement. This is really looking good. Keep in mind, Mike has gone through a lot of these progressive movements already. He's already gone through the foundation, so that's why he's able to execute these things well. And you guys will see that as we move on to the next progression. Let's go back to the left side, Mike, and then we're going to start instituting the rotation. I'm going to have him do about 3 or 4 of them slow for you guys, and he's going to bust out maybe about somewhere around like 10 repetitions ballistically so you can see what it's supposed to look like. All right, Mike, let's get to that neutral standing position. Let's give ourselves a lateral view over here. So nice and slow. He's initiating force with his right glute from here. Let's get a little bit lower from there, Mike. Lean back with the upper body a little further. Beautifully. Good. Excellent. Go again. So right now he's getting that good thoracic rotation. Let's bang out about 10 ballistic repetitions. Scapula back. There you go. Get a little more opening coming forward, Mike. Bingo. So you guys can see right now it's like a sling coming back on each one of them. Give me about another 3, 2, 3. Good. If you hit it like that, I guarantee you that'll really begin to up your cardiovascular system, and it'll give you a major challenge while you're doing this. Let's go again. Let's do the other side. Let's do about 4 with good control so they can kind of see what we're supposed to be doing here. We're leaning back. The body's a completely upright column. Excellent. We pull that scapula back on the right side. Excellent. Scapula back further. Extend that thoracic, Mike. Come on. There you go. That's really good there. And we remember, initiate force with that left glute. Left glute's doing the majority of the work here, and then the right lat just follows. So the glute stimulates the thoracolumbar fascia right here, located around that lower back region, which then primarily promotes an activation of this latissimus dorsi on the right side. Give me about 10 in a row, Mike. Quick ones. So right here, we get that initiation from that left glute. Rotate a little bit more. Bigger rotation, Mike. So now you look at that thoracic spine, man, that is looking great there. Lots of efficiency, very little movement happening in the lumbar. Noticing fatigue now, let's take a break. Okay, let's go into the transverse isometric hold next, Mike. I'm gonna drop this one way down. So if you have resistance bands, be sure to get significantly close. We don't want significant amounts of resistance while we're doing this exercise. The lighter the better, because at this point, it's not gonna require much because your body will not be getting much leverage while you're doing this exercise. Okay, so let's hit that, Mike. Let's bring that back heel off the ground. There you go. And spine is going to be neutral. Thoracic is going to be extended. Bend the knees. Let's get down a little lower, Mike. Bring that back heel off the ground even higher. Navel's going to be in. Move that pelvis back. So now we're noticing that nice torque happening in the obliques here. He's holding that position. Pinky toe up on that right side. Good. Spine is neutral. Everything's looking great. Let's get a lateral view on this side. Scapula's going to remain back. Rotate the pelvis under. Scapula back a little further. Excellent job. Hold that position. So as you can see, he's already breaking a sweat. This is not easy by any stretch of the imagination. Once you really start getting into good execution, this will really be difficult to maintain. Let's do the other side next. At this point, if you're doing that exercise, your core should be completely shot out. After maybe about anywhere between 15 seconds to 20 seconds. We go here. If we're getting perfect execution, this should only take about 5 seconds. So let's go back with that left hip from there, Mike. Left side of the pelvis, good. Rotate the pelvis under. Lift the pinky toe off the ground on the left side. Lift it up even higher. Come on, come on. Pronate that ankle. Excellent job. Spine stays neutral. Thoracic is extended. We rotate to the right a little more. Hold that. Bend the knees. Let's come down lower. Excellent job. We move the hips back. Let's pull the scapula back further. More. Beautiful. Back of the heels up. Hold that position. Really good muscular activation happening here. We got to relax that upper trapezius. But right now, we're really getting great core activation. Let's move that left side back. Hold that position. We got about another 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1, and 0. Take a break. Go through that for about 2 to 3 rounds. If you have the time to do 3 rounds, be sure to do so. Be sure to mix this kind of stuff with your myofascial release to ensure that we get the entire body integrated even better. There's nothing worse than having to try and correct a body that's so structurally dysfunctional from tight musculature and restriction. Then there's nothing worse than having to work a body functionally when a body's that restricted. So be sure to do your myofascial release and your corrective exercises to ensure that you're executing these exercises properly and effectively. So right now, as you saw with Mike, he already got a good sweat broken. You should likely do the same thing if you follow this in a circuit. Be looking for great execution. Try putting yourself on video so you can watch yourself, and then you'll see, okay, am I doing this correctly? Am I not doing this correctly? Start looking for the deficiencies that I put forth, so that way you'll be able to catch these deficiencies on your own, and then you won't replicate the same things, and you'll prevent injury. But even beyond that, you'll be able to build an even more functional body. I hope you guys enjoyed this level. Be sure to practice this. This will be the foundation of all of your movement. Be sure to revert back to this every month or so, even after you progress. Be sure to come back to this to ensure that your body doesn't start going back to its old deficiencies. Great job.